Number 10. Mary I. Now this is a ruler who could have reserved a place in common history as the first woman ever to be the Queen of England. Instead, she is mostly remembered as Life Juice Mary, the name that she acquired because of her staunch and violent opposition to Reformation. I can't say the real word because the internet. Life juice can mean many things, but I hope that you know which Mary is known for being repeated in the mirror, especially when it's in the dark and scary. The most controversial part of her reign was the religious policies. Despite promises a month into her rise to the throne that she would not pursue forced conversion of Protestants, Mary had leading Protestant churchmen imprisoned. She sought to reaffirm papal jurisdiction over England, and when the deal with Rome succeeded, the heresy acts were reinstated, which allowed for the burning of heretics. This sent a wave of fear through England, and around 800 Protestant nobles immediately fled the country. In February 1555, the executions began. Protestant Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was forced to watch the bishops Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer being burned at the stake. Cranmer repented his Protestant faith, and technically under law he should have been absolved as a repentant, but Mary refused to accept Cranmer's absolution and had him burned at the stake as well to set an example. I do apologize if I'm butchering any of these names. By the end of her terror, Mary had almost 300 people executed, most of them by burning at the stake, simply for the crime of being Protestant. Her reign was relatively short, lasting a little over 5 years, since she passed away in 1558 from either ovarian cysts or ovarian cancer and was succeeded by Elizabeth I. Number 9. Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian was born to a relatively wealthy family and had extremely progressive parents, becoming well versed in a wide range of subjects, including writing, music, literature, and most importantly, politics and governmental affairs. At the age of 14, Wu was summoned to the imperial palace to become a concubine of Emperor Taizong. After his passing, the newly anointed Emperor Li Zi, the youngest son of the late emperor who became Emperor Gaizong, brought Wu to the imperial court to be his own concubine. In 654, Wu bore a daughter, but shortly after the birth, it passed away, with evidence showing strangly-wangly things. You know what I'm talking about. Wu accused Empress Wang of the passing, and Wang lost favor with the emperor. The most popular theory is that Wu actually took her own daughter out. Thereafter, the emperor conferred with his chancellors, and despite opposition, demoted Wang, having her imprisoned, and promoted Wu to empress. Later on, the emperor considered having Wang released, but Wu had her executed upon hearing this. Upon her ascension to the throne, Wu began targeting officials who had opposed her rise to power, having them arrested and imprisoned, exiled, forced to take their own lives, or just straight up executed. In 664, she accused several officials of witchcraft and had them executed as well, and their families were forced into labor within the imperial palace. In another incident, she ended her niece with poison, accused 2 others of the passing, and executed them just to make things look good. She eventually passed after repeating bouts with illness, and sadly there's nothing nefarious about that. Number 8. Isabella of Castile. When Isabella was born on the 22nd of April in 1451, there was little chance that she would ever become a monarch of Castile, as she was far removed from the direct royal lineage. War, politics, and subterfuge intervened, however, and for many years the Kingdom of Spain was in turmoil, suffering from civil unrest and treasonous subterfuge. To quell one of the rebellions, the hand of Isabella was promised to the commoner Pedro Gairan Acuna Pacheco. Again, I'm sorry if I butchered it, but on his way to her he suddenly fell ill and he passed away. This immensely fortuitous event for Isabella cemented her devotion to her faith, since she, didn't exactly want to marry a commoner and prayed for divine intervention. Her marriage to Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Castile and Aragon, cemented her future power. After the passing of the King of Castile, the throne was given to Isabella. Her cruelty is recognized in the treatment of non-Christians, which led to the formation of the Spanish Inquisition. Known for its extreme brutality and torture of mostly Jewish and Muslim folks, Isabella waged war on the Kingdom of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, and the last piece to fall in the Spanish Reconquista. While some may see it as the liberation of Spain, for a lot of other people it was just open genocide. By the time Grenada was annexed, 100,000 people were either deceased or enslaved.
Since that highly debated viral clip was mentioned, I'll make the next point about how gratitude is implied, which it's most definitely not. I don't see a lot of gratitude coming from royal families. There is endless videos and pictures of these sour-faced monarchs monarchs, harassing and devaluing the endless service they have accompanying them. Let me hit y'all with an iconic example. Have you seen Downton Abbey? Most folks have. Have you ever noticed one of their royal or aristocratic characters ever say thank you to their servant? No? And that's an intentional detail, as it's been a long since unspoken, at least in British monarchy, that servants are best unthanked and unheard. Now, Alistair Bruce in the BTS documentary about the TV show series explained his perspective, that the servants did everything for their masters, and if thanks were given, it would be necessary to say them at least 60 times a day. That would be, as the English say, tiresome. It does stand that servants are not required to be thanked no matter if they just tied your shoe or wipe your ass. You as a royal have the right to just scoff and point and expect results. But at least one royal who can't verbally berate you is the revered royal pets. Multiple royal houses and their respective rulers have decided to use these rules and servants to treat their pets as an extension of themselves. By personifying them, even just trimming a corgi's nails too short could get you proverbially beheaded and definitively fired. Some famous examples of royals who have servants service their pets are Queen Elizabeth II staged a funeral for a chameleon, and an Indian ruler Muhammad Mahabat Khan threw a lavish elaborate wedding for his dog. Louis of France took being a cat person to a whole other level and basically turned Versailles into a giant breeding ground. Charles II of England issued a royal law that his iconic King Charles Spaniels, which are obviously named after him, have license to walk anywhere in the kingdom without harassment, even Parliament. And of course, who can forget Caligula, who appointed his favorite horse, Icarus, as an official senator. But I'd have to say, I imagine there's not much worse than food tasting. Normally, you'd be able to think this wouldn't be so bad. Wrong, let me make it worse. So obviously, they're tasting it for poison and other tricky little substances that could take down a king. What if the soup was laced with arsenic? How easy is it to slip into the kitchen and lace the king's food with belladonna or hemlock? The food tester was always a servant, or sometimes even a slave, or a prisoner. And if you think about those status of those people, well, they were eating mush flour and bone broth and then calling it a day. Given the opportunity to be a food taster means the literal taste of luxury. The only effed part is the first bite of flavorful rice you're ever going to eat in your life, you're going to immediately die. Maybe. It'd be enough for you to put off eating any meal you didn't prepare yourself, and there'd be no way of knowing if the food was deadly until after you've eaten it. In 1594, there was a plot to poison Queen Elizabeth, apparently the King of Spain, as the Spanish were enemies of England at the time. A group of Portuguese men had agreed to carry out the dirty work, including the Queen's own physician Rodrigo Lopez. Once the plot was uncovered, all men were executed. And it's not just our ancient royals that brought people on to do this task. Naturally, President Putin has a food taster as part of his security team. No hoovering, which is British for don't vacuum. In 2011, Royal Servants was uploaded to YouTube, a documentary that gave insight into what it's like working for the royal family, including accounts from former butlers, chefs, nannies, and footmen. To quote the narrator, the best servant is one that is neither seen nor heard. The royal family demands the most professional servants in the world, the kind of servants that would rather die than make a mistake. She continues on in this not pretentious at all breakdown, saying that behind the scenes, butlers lay out clothes, footmen carry early morning trays, and cleaners sweep carpets, lest royal ears are offended by vacuum cleaners. One rule cleaners must follow is that they have to sweep the floors instead of hoovering them, because the sound may be too loud, especially in the early morning. I don't know if you guys have seen these palaces, but they're about 110% red carpet, and it's not that cheap kind. This stuff probably holds onto dirt the way your homie holds onto their cheating ex. Not being permitted to use such modern inventions makes their job not even a little, but a lot more difficult. Immensely. They have to quite literally sweep the carpets, the most ineffective way to clean a carpet that's tacked into the ground. And they're already being held at a higher standard than really any other servant on earth. But don't forget, after you're done measuring the carrots, you feed the horses, and sweeping a carpet, you also have to kiss the linens. Whichever unfortunate servant was tasked with making Henry VIII's bed after he woke up in the morning was then required to kiss every part of the linen to prove he hadn't smeared poison on them. What? Don't get me wrong, Henry was like intensely and increasingly paranoid. You can go check my recent video, Top 10 King Henry VIII Facts You Never Knew, to learn more. more about his whole mess. But anyways, someone screws the pooch. Pretty sure it's Ambroise Parche, the 16th century French royal physician, who once wrote, "Now poisons do not only kill being taken into the body, but some being put or applied outwardly." And now this delusional hypochondriac finds out the poison can sink in through his skin, not just be ingested, and he insists on this gross ritual. In an era where sheets don't get washed, and he doesn't wash, and he's all sweaty and gouty, and banging tons of biddies in that bed. Imagine having to kiss those sheets every morning. That's the real poison. R.I.P. dude. Mint essence oil under the nose, and I'm just praying for you. When the standard of hygiene is so low, your only request is that X marks the spot. Eleanor Harmon, the author of The Royal Art of Poison, says royal palaces, some courtiers don't even bother to look for a chamber pot, but just dropped their britches and did their business. All of their business. All of it. All of it in the staircases, the hallways, or the fireplaces. In Versailles, women just pulled up their skirts to pee where they stood, and some men urinated off the balustrade in the middle of the royal chapel. The smelly truth is that Hampton Court, that of Henry VIII, was not well equipped to serve the bodily needs of hundreds upon hundreds of servants. During the king's boisterous banquets, busy servants regularly needed the call of nature, so they relieved themselves in hidden hallway corridors or on sizzling fireplaces that were cooking the food. I need a minute with that one. Anyways, the walls reeked of urine so badly that according to historian Lucy Worsley in her book If Walls Could Talk, the palace management would have had crosses chalked into the walls with the hope that people would be reluctant to desecrate a religious symbol. That's right. While servants were always encouraged to pee in vats, so their urine could be used to clean later, to keep servants and courtiers from urinating on the garden walls, Henry had large crosses painted in problem spots, I guess. But instead of deterring men from relieving themselves, what it did was literally give them a target. To fix the problem, Henry VIII then realized he had to make bathrooms, so he constructed a giant toilet block by the River Thames called the Great House of Easement. And of course, last but not least, fresh out the kitchen of Henry VIII is Dee's roasted chestnuts. King Henry VIII's kitchen at Hampton Court Palace was one of the largest kitchens in Europe, and obviously it would have had to be to service the banquets of grandeur I was just talking about. There were huge wood fireplaces producing an average of 800 to 1,000 meals in a day, courtesy of just a mere 200 cooks. Naturally, that amount of ovens and that amount of cooks in the kitchen, yeah, it's downright cozy. And the average of 1.3 million logs were burnt, creating a hellish atmosphere, leaving the cooks drained and drenched in sweat. From roasting meats to boiling cauldrons, the kitchen of Henry VIII was no less than passing as the underworld. So, what happened in all this heat, dare say? Did they crack a window? Did they get some ice? Take a smoke break, maybe? Nah, the cooks just took off all their clothes to tolerate the temperature while it's cooking. Just to reiterate, all their clothes. All of them. But alas, the atrocities were never ending for these men, as King Henry VIII issued an order to stop being naked or in garments of such vileness as they do now, nor lie in the nights and days in the kitchen or the ground by the fireside. To combat the problem, clerks of the kitchen were instructed to purchase honest and wholesome garments for the staff. And guess what that was? There's a reason the apron covers the front.
Number 10, the young czar. Being the leader of a nation is hard. I play a lot of city builders, trust me, I know. Being the leader of a nation whose people have been brutally oppressed by your family's dynasty for 300 years and in general living in very poor conditions, especially compared to the rest of the world, that's hard too. Even harder. Nicholas II inherited the throne from his father, which sounds great, but in reality was a lot of pressure to do so. As it turns out, Russia was in need of drastic change, and they would get it from the people and a bald man with very pointy facial hair. A communist revolution saw the Empire of Russia fall. 300 years of Romanov rule end overnight, as the Tsar was forced to abdicate his throne. So what's his crime? Well, not doing anything. Negligence. He did so much nothing that people had to do something. Number 9. Nero's steam. We've talked about Emperor Nero quite a lot on this channel, but that's because he's the down bad Roman emperor who puts opulence in Pax Romana. It's hard to pinpoint an exact crime or moment from him, as he's the guy you think about when you think of Roman emperors. However, his crimes against his wife Claudia Octavia are very notable. So when Nero was getting remarried, he had to get rid of Octavia. I mean, you can't have like 40 wives, that's you gotta get rid of her. But how? I mean, how do you get rid of a woman like that? He actually did the whole James Bond villain thing where the victim gets placed into a trap. It's very crude, but theatrical, because remember, that theatrics are important, remember that, folks. Hence, Octavia was banished to an island where shortly after she was locked into a vapor bath, where she suffocated. Naturally, to make himself look better, they made it look like she did it, not him. So yeah, what a great guy. What an absolute hero in that story. Definitely not a villain. Number 8, Afzal Khan. Everyone remembers King Henry VIII for doing what he did to his wives. A Nazi, slap on the wrist, Nazi, don't do that, for shame. However, I would like to offer Afzal Khan as the alternative monster here. He didn't unalive a handful of wives like Henry, no. He actually managed to rack up a count of 63. Yep, you heard me right, 63. First off, I don't know how you have that many wives and or remember names, let alone birthdays and anniversaries. I would not do very well in that situation. Well, what's the reason for all this blood spilling? It's pretty horrible, actually. Simply because he was being invaded, and the guy who was invading him and winning was slightly nicer to women and was going to most likely give them a better life. Jeez, talk about if I can't have it, no one can. God. Number 7, Caligula's wife. I think in a healthy relationship, you ought to put your partner on a pedestal. Maybe your partner is drop dead gorgeous, a promising athlete, or really enjoys building Legos. Nice TIE fighter, babe, way to go. Yeah. Emperor Caligula of Rome liked to put his wife on a pedestal, literally. And while on this pedestal, she was wearing nothing but her birthday suit. Oh boy. While all of his friends, politicians, generals got to gawk and stare at her, and in some weird goth power flex, he would oftentimes hold a knife to her and tell her that he could just end her life whenever he wanted because he can do that. Not to mention the guy had a complete narcissist complex, building statues of himself everywhere just so she can like, oh great, there he is again, it's him again. Number 6, Genghis Khan. I bring the man up again because he's responsible for so much loss, so much blood spill, so much pain. Sure, they were effective warriors and archers, but they were brutal, dude, especially him. They took what they wanted when they wanted, and it said that he was responsible for so many lives lost that it affected the carbon footprint of the planet. Dude, that's insane. That is literally insane. Also to note his treatment of rather mistreatment of women. YouTube won't let me say much, but I can tell you that these ladies were not inviting him into their bedrooms. It wasn't good. As it stands today, because of his bedroom misconduct, his DNA still lives on. 5% of men worldwide share his DNA. Number 5, Pedro of Castile. Pedro of Castile was doing as the European monarchs do. Sometimes you gotta marry for alliances. Sure, it makes sense. Your kingdom is much less likely to get steamrolled by a larger kingdom if you have an alliance with fellow kingdoms, or the bigger kingdom itself, actually. Pedro of Castile married the young Blanche of Bourbon of France, and so Spain could just be a wee bit more snug, in case the English come over. You gotta be careful. But Pedro just wasn't having it. What he was having instead was a mistress named Maria. So instead of enduring a loveless marriage, he had poor Blanche locked away in a tower, just like Sleeping Beauty. Except a handsome prince was not coming to rescue this damsel in distress, but a man with a black hood and a sharpened axe. You know what I'm talking about. As Pedro had her unalived. I was gonna make a joke about Rapunzel and let down some hair so she could make an escape, but I mean that's just awful, really. Imagine being locked up in a tower for so long. Sure, I love the indoors, but you gotta let me out at some point, Chief. Do you think I get food delivery apps to work up in a tower? Because otherwise you have to let me out, dude. Comic-Con's coming. Anime Convention North's coming, buddy. I gotta go. Gotta get my Naruto on, bro. Come on, man. Number 4, hands-on funeral. This one's just gross. When you're in a relationship, it can provide you with some great things. Someone to go through life with. Companionship. Love. And if you're lucky, someone who's a good cook or a baker. Oh, love me some baked goods. However, also in a relationship, sometimes you do more than that. Sometimes you get a little close under the sheets, if you know what I'm saying. Take King Philip V, for an example, who loved loving his wife so much that he just couldn't help himself, you know? Like for instance, when his wife tragically passed away, he wanted one last ride. But he penciled in one more trip to Toe Curl City before she was laid to rest. God, that doesn't seem right, you know? That just let her go peacefully, you know? Let her just. Number 3, Lenin. Okay, while not a king in the most stereotypical sense, he did dethrone a king and made himself an autocratic dictator, which is basically a king just modern. Trust me, it is. Yep, trust me. In a nutshell, Lenin had been anti-royal for most of his life, but after some help from some sneaky Germans and other Soviets loyal to his cause, the Tsar had no choice but to abdicate, like I said at the top of the list. He abolished the Tsar's secret police and then put in his own. And had people oppressed, which was one of the main reasons why the whole revolution started in the first place. See what I'm getting at? He was supposed to get rid of the evil monarch, and he became the evil monarch. Well, see, then a civil war broke out, and then he was worried that the exiled Tsar might escape and try to retake the throne, and, well, he had some goons take care of him, and, well, the family too. You can never be too sure. You gotta take care of everything. You gotta get rid of everybody. You just can't be too sure. Number 2, Pope John XII. For those who aren't very religious like myself, the Pope is the big one. He's next to God, and for a minute there, he was the most powerful man on earth. Seriously, I mean, this guy could crown kings. He's the king of the Vatican and the king of kings in the Holy Scripture. It's kind of serious. And today he's got a really cool car for parades. The Popemobile is pretty sick, not gonna lie. However, Pope John XII was anything but a sweet old man who delivers the holy messages from God. This Pope was doing a lot of anti-Pope behavior, if you will. Now, I for one wouldn't care if the man had a girlfriend or a glass of wine. Heck, some rules need to be changed, but this Pope was most known for his lavish, how you say, adult-themed parties, and was known for getting hangovers. It got so bad at one point, it started a war. Number 1, not so slick shady. Marshall Mathers, Eminem, the king of rap, and named king of hip hop by Rolling Stones magazine. Hence he's a king, I gotcha. Despite what you think of the man's lyrics, especially vulgarity, he's an excellent wordsmith and could write rhymes that would leave you tongue twisted. However, I don't think it would come to anyone's surprise that the man's got a few charges under his belt, especially the way he talks about Kim. There's a couple bad things said about her, I don't know. Back in 2001, arguably the peak of his career, Eminem assaulted somebody in a nightclub after getting fresh with his wife. He got 2 years probation. Maybe he is saying the things he's saying in those songs. Maybe he's telling the truth. I don't know. Number 10, King Midas. Most people know the story of King Midas, but in a nutshell, he was a king who was granted the power of everything he touched turned to solid gold. So, no, he didn't exactly buy anything with that kind of power, but the man can have anything he wants or buy anything he wants. It's a lot of gold. This sounds great, but it's really awful for a couple of reasons. One, that is pretty much the moral of the story, and the other is, well, some basic economy stuff. The first reason this would suck is that, one, you should never be too greedy, and you really shouldn't. And you should always be careful what you wish for. This blessing quickly turned into a curse as Midas could no longer eat. Which, that's bad. Not eating and everything you touch turned to gold. Ugh, you couldn't hug anybody, it's terrible. The other issue would be his wealth. You'd have to be very careful on how many items you actually touched, as producing too much gold would eventually devalue the price of gold. Especially if you touch a bed or something, that's a lot of gold. Imagine how much a solid gold bed would weigh, or how much that would be worth. So in reality, you would be both starving and poor. Number 9, Mansa Musa. Sort of related to the King Midas issue, Mansa Musa was probably the richest man to ever walk the face of the earth. A king from northern Africa who exploited his country's salt and gold reserves. His estimated wealth today would be around the $400 billion mark. $400 billion US. Ooh, that's a lot of money. Tough to actually measure it exactly because it was from so long ago, but it could be less, and some say it could actually even be more. Mansa Musa went on tour one year to see all the beautiful things he could of the ancient world, and you can't take a little vacation without buying something at the gift shop. Mansa Musa was so rich and spent so much money in a few towns that he visited that he single-handedly upset the economy of those cities. Elon Musk wishes he could. So he basically bought a lot of stuff, and it was unusual because it upset the economy. Like, he destroyed the economy of those towns. That's insane. Number 8, Michael Jackson, the king of pop. Ah, see, I got you. I pulled a sneaky on you. But yeah, he's still a king. And maybe he was the biggest celebrity who ever lived. Would Halloween really be Halloween without Thriller? And how could cool guys let you know they were cool in the 80s if they didn't have all that leather jacket and stuff? You wouldn't be able to know. You just wouldn't. Well, maybe some things you don't know about Michael Jackson were his shopping habits. The man loved shopping. And with that kind of money, well, you can do anything. Well, some may remember his chimp, his Neverland mansion complete with carnival rides, an arcade, and even an oxygen chamber in case Darth Vader was coming over to stay the night. However, something very strange the man tried to do was he tried to buy a very strange man himself, or rather his bones. For some reason, Michael had a fascination with the Elephant Man, a man with severe facial deformities and freak show performer from the late 1800s. Michael tried to purchase his remains. That's it. That's the point. He tried to buy him. They wouldn't let him, but he tried. That's a weird thing to buy. Whenever I hit the number, I don't go, hey, 1-800 museum people, someone bring me King Tut. I want it.
Number 7. Murad IV. Something about kings being great also goes hand in hand with them being terrible at the same time. 17th Sultan of the Ottoman throne, Murad IV came to power in September 1623 at the age of 11. But since he was so young, the Ottomans were ruled by his mother, Kosum Sultan, and other relatives, who did a pretty horrendous job. As a tween, he walked around the cities dressed as a commoner and would keep a list of those he could benefit from and those he could punish. At 11. At 21, he took control and also took some extreme precautions in order to eliminate the corruption within the empire, banning the use of alcohol and tobacco and coming up with severe measurements for the regular collection of taxes. Murad IV would never be okay with people disobeying his laws and directives, even going around the city in plain clothes to check any undisciplined actions by the locals, and he would personally punish the offenders. He did a lot for the Ottomans, but boy was he harsh about it. He destroyed coffee houses, like, come on man. Number 6. Phalaris. Phalaris of Akragas was a tyrannical Sicilian ruler from around 571 to 554 BC. And this dude was so bad his own people overthrew him after his 16 years of rule. Phalaris became ruler by some unconventional ways when it came to other kings on this list. Some think he started as a farmer who held office, and other more fun stories say he was appointed to build a temple, and instead of doing that he took the money and built a fortress, allowing him to take power. He expanded the territory of Akragas from the south coast of Sicily all the way up to the north coast, but he was known much better for how gosh darn cruel he was. The most famous story would have to be the one of the Brazen Bull. An engineer was hired by Phalaris to create a new device for doing heinous things to his prisoners. The engineer presented him with a bronze bull. There was a door that could be opened to place a prisoner inside, then they would light a fire underneath, heating up the bull and causing the poor soul inside to thrash about and yell, making the bull seem alive. He then used it on the engineer. Thanks to the citizens' revolt though, he got to be the last victim of the bull. Looks like karma's a bull. Number 5. Louis XIV. King of France, the Sun King, the God-given. Ruling from 1638 to 1715, Louis XIV was well known for his love of art, which was apparent in the royal palace of Versailles he created, his love of women for his multiple wives and many more mistresses, and the comparison of himself to God, even taking up the sun as his symbol, being representative of Apollo, the sun god, and the literal reason we're all alive. A good symbol, honestly. The Palace of Versailles was used to host comedies, operas, and tragedies, and spectacular parties. His suite in the palace was made up of 3 apartments all for himself. The palace was big enough to hold his entire court so that none of them could really plot against him without him knowing. It also contained the Hall of Mirrors, which was a 71-meter long room with 357 mirrors around 17 arches opposite the massive windows. Unlike most other kings on this list, Louis XIV was a fantastic ruler. He was an incredibly lavish one though, which equals spoiled in my mind. Number 4. Ivan the Terrible. Ivan Tsar was a great military leader, pretty much setting up the Russian Empire. A great leader with an absolutely terrible temper. His rage-filled outbursts just got worse and worse over the years of his rule from 1530 to 1584. One of these incidents even ending in the stab-filled demise of his own son. He had a special force called the Oprachina who eliminated anybody he felt threatened him, and he led this force to Novigrad in 1572, resulting in the massacre of Novigrad, which gets him a firm place as one of the cruelest of Russian rulers. There is the even more popular story of him making that peculiar looking castle in Moscow, and then dispatching the man who designed it so no one else could have one. He is one of the most cruel, paranoid, bad-tempered, and greedy rulers in not just Russian history, but history in general. Literally terrible. Number 3. Nero. Another Roman emperor who was effectively insane. Seems to be like a trend. Best known for his spicy parties, political delifings, persecution of Christians, and love for music that led to the rumor that Nero played the fiddle while Rome burned during the Great Fire of 64 AD, Nero first became emperor at 17, and the first little bit of his rule saw him be responsible for the demise of multiple people, including his mother and his newest wife, Poppaea, in a casual outburst of rage. He was quite the artist, singing and performing and encouraging others to take lessons, and he held sport events all the time, even taking part himself. Remember that fire I talked about? Well, some people believe he may have started it himself in order to make a bigger palace. But if he did or didn't, he blamed the Christians and punished them much more than necessary, like dressing them in animal skins and having them torn apart by dogs, or being burned to the afterlife in pyres that would light his own garden parties. Oh, and he bankrupted the Roman treasury building the aforementioned palace where he held his ridiculous parties we talked about before with a 100-foot golden statue of himself. Nice. Number 2. Bad King John. Kings be bad sometimes. But when it came to lechery, treachery, and shocking acts of cruelty, the king who sealed the Magna Carta takes the cake. According to the historians at least. While known for the Magna Carta, he is also well known as the king involved in the stories of Robin Hood. But these being fairy tales, was he really that bad? No, he was much, much, much worse. During the time that he ruled, most nobles who were captured in war were kept in not so bad confinement. John said no though. Like when he captured his own nephew, who miraculously disappeared, and about 22 knights who were sent to a castle to starve to the afterlife, to stop their families from continuing to fight. He did the same thing to the wife and son of his former friend. If that weren't bad enough, when his brother, who was king at the time, was taken prisoner, he tried to seize the throne, and he is famous for forcing himself on the wives and daughters of his own barons. As you may remember from Robin Hood, there was a monetary aspect to his horribleness as well. The taxes and fines he levied were to the point of extortion. I talked to Andrew, who talked to the chief, and he said, King John ain't it. Number 1. Henry VIII. Here we are, the main man himself. We've talked about him before, and how could we not? He's arguably one of the most infamous English kings. Historians have described him as obsessive, syphilitic, and a self-indulgent wife delifer and tyrant. These historians probably leave the best Google reviews. It's not just his whole multiple wives to find a male heir situation that makes him spoiled. Well, kind of it is. To achieve his personal ends, he literally spurred on a religious revolution that created the Church of England, the formal end of monasteries, and the Reformation. Which is hilarious because he wrote a treatise against Martin Luther that had him named Defender of the Faith by the Pope. Ironic. He, like many of the others, was a lover of art, music, and sport, at least in his younger years. But he was also an incredibly costly ruler. While he unified much of England with Wales and Ireland, in 1520, with King Francis I of France, Henry co-hosted the Field of the Cloth of Gold, which was incredibly lavish and showed off his immaturity. Speaking of immaturity, there are tons of cases where people were separated from their heads simply for not giving him what he wanted, including some of his friends and his wives.
Number 10, Pepe II. When you were 6 years old, I'm pretty sure the only responsibility you had was to tell your mom if you wet the bed by accident, or making sure you clean up after yourself, and of course, just being a kid. But for Pepe II, this was a tiny child ruling a massive kingdom. His priorities was to rule Egypt and be the young king he was literally born to be. I mean, hey, at least this 6-year-old has a job, so what's your excuse? Now, keep in mind, this was a 6-year-old, and he was obviously at one point going to be extremely spoiled, and of course, court members would travel everywhere to impress him with gifts. So, one of his court members got him a dancing pygmy from Africa, knowing very well his new young pharaoh was going to freak the heck out seeing him. Pepe was so obsessed and extremely attached to the dancer that he told the man who found the pygmy that he was under strict rules to make sure nothing happens to him. In life, or in death, he better take care of his personal dancer, and when Pepe got older, his demands started getting more like Cusco from the Emperor's New Groove, plus a little bit more inhumane, where he had his slaves stripped naked and covered in honey. He did this because he wanted his slaves to follow him around just to keep the flies away. Either way, he was far the longest ruling Egyptian monarch at 94 years old, and Pepe's rule ended up in economy disarray due to virtually no oversight. Number 9. Pharaohs. There's always going to be P mentioned somewhere when it comes to history's gross weird acts, and I am sorry. Pharaohs was a pharaoh who suffered from blindness, and his father, Sesterus, may have passed it down to him, but of course Egyptian courts official said it was a curse. The assumption of the cause was because when Pharaoh was young, he threw a spear into the Nile River for flooding, and the gods got mad and struck him blind. 10 years later, Pharaoh was getting annoyed at his blindness, and so an oracle told him he can get his sight back if he washes his eyes with the urine of a woman who has never slept with anyone other than her husband. So he did just that. He would try to use his own wives, but it didn't work, which now him and his wife had to go to counseling for potential cheating, and so then he would have to go around town and ask every woman to pee in a pot and pour it into his eyes. And somehow it worked. He found a woman who wasn't cheating on her husband, and he got his eyesight back. He married her on the spot, burned his old wife, and that was that. Of course, it was unlikely that Pharaoh really got his sight back through magical urine, but he just needed a good story to explain his weird habit. Number 8, Cleopatra VII. I will briefly mention her chaotic and absolutely horrendous family in a moment, but Cleopatra VII, or as we know her as only and solely as Cleopatra, she was known not just for her intellect and beauty, but her Twilight love-like triangle relationships with hot bod Julius Caesar and raging wolfman Mark Antony. Of course, there is some debate if whether or not she was a mad king. After all, she was brilliant in using her tactics to ensnare and bewitch the minds and bodies of powerful men in order to ensure the security of her kingdom, but unfortunately her ego did get in the way and lost the battle with Mark Antony, and Egypt then became a province of the Roman Empire, bringing in an end to her reign. But the way she would try to manipulate these leaders would be one for the books. Kris Jenner works hard, but Cleopatra works harder. At one point she needed to seduce Julius Caesar, but she was not allowed at any point to get physical with him, let alone with him. So she would strip naked and rolled herself into some bed sheets or rugs and told his servants to DoorDash deliver her to his door. And when they said, "Hey Julius, we got a package for you," they rolled her out of those sheets and she rolled into his. And they gave that delivery a full 5 stars, tip included. But of course, the main reason why she's even on this list is because she assassinated her siblings, including the 2 she was married to, careless about the money like spending $10 to $20 million on a single meal, and of course brainwashing her citizens, believing that she was their goddess and allowing the downfall of Egypt through failed military tactics.
Number 7, Elvis Presley. Lots of similarities today. Elvis Presley, before Michael Jackson, he was probably the most famous person to ever exist. The king of rock and roll, baby, that's right. All I'll say is phone your grandma and ask her how she feels about him. She probably says she loves his music and those gyrating hips. At the time, it was pretty controversial. Boy, only if they knew what was going on today. Whew. Sorry 50s atomic families. Well, being that Elvis Presley was the king and the first celebrity to be idolized the way we do with modern celebrities, he became quite wealthy. Well, with all that money, he bought some weird things, including a chimp. Everyone's buying a monkey, they want a zoo, I don't know. A mansion property he named Graceland, a pink Cadillac for his mother, and strangely enough, he bought FDR's yacht. Yeah, what? That's so weird. Good president, sure, but does it really have room for a monkey in a pink Cadillac? I don't know. Number 6, French royalty. This one is more about Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI. It's kind of like a 2-pack, kind of like a couple, but trust me, it all makes sense in the end. Again, anything they bought, it was probably the king's wallet, wasn't it? Okay, so when your country is starving, demanding more rights, and in general, life really sucks, what's the next best thing you do? Buy a $12 million necklace. Yeah, right, okay, I've said that before, sure. Okay, Ched, what else? Continue to live your opulent life on the king's and people's dimes. Sure, why not? It makes sense, okay. I'm talking too much. Well, something I learned today and something that Taylor showed me is that I guess the last queen of France was a little lonely, so what did King Louis do to fix this? Spend more time with her? Nay. Buy her a new dog? Nay, sir and madams. He had her pug from Austria imported to the country. And anyone can tell you that when something is imported, you are going to be dishing out a few more dosh. Yes, that's right. They imported her pug from Austria. Imagine how that sounds when your house is literally falling apart, you're starving, and you pay the most taxes. Makes you want to put heads on pikes. That's what it makes you want to do. Can you imagine that? We're all poor and hungry. She's like, well, look at my dog. It's my dog. They're French, they don't sound like that, but this is my dog, look at my dog, here he is. Number 5, King of Egypt. His Majesty Farouk I, by the grace of God, King of Egypt and the Sudan, that was his full title, was disposed during his nation's 1952 revolution and spent the remainder of his days in exile to Italy. In his haste to avoid getting the Mussolini treatment, he left behind a majority of his most prized possessions. When the people got a look at what he was storing behind the walls of his residence, they were a bit disgusted to find an excessive number of expensive suits, rare stamps and coins, jewels, luxury vehicles, and many other things that I will never afford. Now, what else would he have that would be considered strange? I'll let you take a guess. Was it A, a blam blam cachet, B, piles and piles of a white substance that made the 80s fun, or C, an unsettling amount of gardening magazines? Go ahead and let us know in the comments below. I'll give you a second. Nope, time's up. If you said secret option D, you'd be right. What was it, you ask? Well, it was a disturbing amount of adult entertainment. So much so, it wouldn't even fit underneath his mattress. Man, that's a lot. That's too much. That's too much. Number 4, Peter the Third. Remember the last time you played with your toys as a kid? Same. And let us know what your favorite toys were as a kid. Let's see if we have some shared favorites. I'm actually curious. That's kind of a cool thing to talk about. Well, for Peter the Third, it was little army men, or tin soldiers, I guess you'd call them. And yes, he played with them as an adult, staging mock battles. Is it the weirdest thing ever? No, it's not. But he was a king, so that's a wee bit strange. Hey, I love army men just as much as the next guy, especially those little green plastic dudes. I used to love those video games too. Very underrated in my opinion. Love that stuff. It also makes me think of that scene in Spaceballs. Enough references aside, you never really know someone until you've seen the money they've spent on their army men collection. Number 3, Ibrahim the First. Fur everywhere. Ibrahim I of the Ottoman Empire was the 18th Sultan and the #1 purchaser of fine furs. Personally, I've never had any fine furs. I grew up in the trailer park and Mama always said that fur was cruel anyway, so I never felt the luxury of fine furs, if you will. It must be nice because Ibrahim loved them so much. Like, he really loved them. His whole wardrobe consisted of them, in fact. Plus, his walls were covered in them. And apparently even his curtains. I don't do well in heat, so I'll pass on that. I'd be sweating way too much. Too much fur. Number 2, the locksmith. Who are you and how'd you get in here? I'm the locksmith, and I'm the locksmith. Classic Leslie Nielsen. God, I love that guy. I love those movies. I'd love to make one day. Or star in one. Hollywood, call me. King Louis XVI, the last king of France. We're back to him again. The man spent his time and money on something rather strange. No, not all was spent on his wife and her life, and yeah, I'm kind of putting him on the list twice, but trust me, it's weird. I mean, come on, he gave the queen whatever the heck she wanted. Well, apparently he loved to spend his time and money on locksmithing. What? Yeah, that's so weird. He would spend his time trying to get into locks and understand them. He was also stated as saying that every man should have a passion. Hey, maybe put down the locks and start helping the people as a passion. There's an idea. What a great idea. Feed the people. Instead, I'm just going to work on this lock. I'm just going to go ahead and just, yeah, almost got it. Yep. Number 1, Christian VII of Denmark. I saw this and I just had to put it on here. I mean, come on. Apparently the guy wasn't very mentally stable. I mean, who is these days? Apparently the royal spent a lot of his time waxing his carrot, polishing the flagpole, tenderizing the gabagoo, charming the snake, self-firing on all cylinders, the one-handed bedroom dance, what I did all summer long in high school. You get the point, okay? You understand what I'm trying to say. Truth of the matter is, you don't get there with a little help from Vaseline or St. Ives. The man bought time so he could be this way. The man is either a legend or a crazy person. Imagine having that much money and that much time in your day that that's all you do.
Number 10, the king of hobbies. Everyone has their interests, right? Like, for example, I like video games, and I like watching people scream at their teammates for not helping everyone else out. I'm looking at you, Blake. For kings back in the day, they didn't have people on Rocket League to scream at, so they had to find other interests. For Tsar Peter the Great, he had a lot of interests, and they were all very bizarre. Firstly, he had an obsession with short people, especially dwarves. To him, they were like his real-life dolls or something, and he would hold weddings for them and even hold lavish funerals, complete with small horses pulling a small coffin on a carriage and even a very short priest to hold the ceremony. But other than this obsession with short people, he also dabbled a bit in medicine. He liked watching surgeries be performed like he was trying to be on Grey's Anatomy or something, but when watching the surgeries just wasn't enough for him, he would sometimes perform them himself. Now remember, he's not a doctor, so it's no surprise to learn that these surgeries rarely ever went well and people died. I certainly wouldn't trust him to give me any kind of surgery, but he was a king so he could do whatever he wanted. Peter the Great also loved dentistry. It is said that if you wanted to get all buddy-buddy with the king, all you had to do was let him pull your tooth. Sounds like the guy was one heartbreak away from starting his own medical drama, but in the worst way.
Number 9, banning coffee. This is the worst of the worst, people. Murad IV, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The guy banned coffee like an absolute monster. No more triples for you. He was born in 1612, and for the most part, his mother was ruling through him because he was so young. That's often the case with most of these young rulers. They just get, hey, you're 7, now you rule a kingdom, enjoy. It's, it's tough, they're not gonna know what's going on. But when he got a little bit older, he put forth these laws, punishable by death, might I add, in order to get things back on track. That was the key. He banned coffee, tobacco, and alcohol. He would actually disguise himself as a civilian during the nighttime and would wander around aimlessly in hopes that he would find one of these dark roast renegades. If you were caught outside having a quick smoke break, you weren't arrested, you didn't get fined, but rather Murad IV himself would take your head off right there in the streets. No trial, no jury, just straight to execution. All because you're drinking a Bud Light Lime.
At number 8, why you mad? Now this could be a bit of a controversial opinion, but if your name includes the words the mad, I would assume that you're not doing too great, right? I mean, you have to earn that title, and if it's a title that harsh, that simply begs the question, what in the HE double hockey sticks did you do to get that name? Well, for Charles the Mad, he did a lot. Charles became king when he was only 11 years old, so that certainly didn't help his development, and knowing this kind of helps explain a lot of his actions. He was known for getting really angry and throwing fits of rage, and was known to give people the gift of the big sleep, if you know what I mean. Charles didn't always kill people though, only sometimes. Other times he liked to switch things up. Sometimes he would run around his palace pretending to be a wolf. Other times he would go through phases where he just really didn't want to keep up with his personal hygiene, and he would get so gross that he literally had to be cut out of his own clothes. Now I don't know how long you have to go without bathing to get to that point, but really I don't think I want to know the answer to that question. Charles also thought that he was made of glass, and so he would go through phases where he would sit completely still so that he didn't break. Kind of like Drax from Guardians of the Galaxy, but not as, you know, extraterrestrial. Well, maybe he was. That honestly would explain a lot.
Number 7, food. Nice. Whether you like it or not, at some point in your life you're gonna have to eat, and if you're like me, that means all the time. Steaks, ribs, beer, Burger King, pizza, pasta, ham, and chicken wings. Nice. It should be no surprise that I like beer and barbecue, and to answer your question, yes, I am the most fun guy to be around at the barbecue. Why? I just like to have fun and I like to eat good food, man. That's just it. Imagine a world, however, where there is no pizza and chicken wings. I know, it's horrible, right? Ugh. Food was always a concern of commoners in ancient times, and as much as I love meat, it wasn't always available. They just didn't live in the industrial agricultural world that we live in today. For Romans, it was a steady diet of breads and nuts, and if they were lucky, maybe some cheese or soup. But for the kings and emperors of old, well, if you feel like vomiting after all you can eat buffets, it makes you feel, you know, some first world kind of guilt, then look no further than ancient kings. Food might be the most excessive way they live, really. All kinds of meats all the time, beer, wine, fresh fruit and vegetables, which for health reasons is pretty huge, and to make them huge, maybe even some desserts. The Egyptians, for example, were known for their sweets. And now I'm hungry. We should go to a banquet together.
Number 6, 6,000 knights. Being a medieval knight, obviously, it sounds cool. They have the sword, the horse, the flowing hair, all that good stuff. They're saving the damsel in distress in some sort of tower. Well, no, it actually sucked being a knight at all. First of all, chainmail. You know how heavy chainmail is alone by itself? It's like 55 pounds. All that chainmail underneath your armor, no way. My body, this Q-tip spine would just break in half. No way. I can't even get on a horse wearing jeans and a shirt, let alone chainmail. Being a knight is something that starts when you're 7 years old as well. You gotta start as a little tot, a little royal tot. Then you'd be given to a noble to learn and be wise for 7 years, some, you know, Yoda type scenario. And then at age 14, you become a squire. A knight's intern, not an ideal job to have when you're 14, but if you stick it out just 7 more years, then you're an official ting, ting, knight. That's it. But then what? Do kings have 2 knights? Do they have 4 each? Is it like a breakdance squad? Is it like 8s, groups of 8s? Like, how do we do this? Henry II of England could call up to 6,000 knights. This was back in the late 12th century. That's a lot of backup. That's a lot of shiny, majestical backup. My favorite knight still to this day, I don't care, Martin Lawrence.
Jamal, Scott, Walker.
FBI, what's up? What's happening, y'all?
Number 5, big money. This is no surprise to anyone, I'm sure, but back in the day, I'd argue the division between wealth and poor was larger than today. Kings had it all. I mean, if you listen to what Taylor's saying, he knows what he's talking about. Food, water, power, what else is there? Well, how about the coinage to make it all happen? The bread, the guap, the dosh, and my favorite, the cheddar. Yes, that's right, the ancient king's wealth. Whatever they didn't already possess, they could take by force or simply just bought with incalculable riches. with uncalculable riches. So much money. They had so much money. I can't make it clear. They had a lot of money. A great example of this was Mansa Musa, a very wealthy king from the Mali Empire. It's speculated he might have been the wealthiest person to ever walk the face of the earth. Earning his riches through the trading of gold and salt, he decided to show the international community how rich he was, and went on tour, because that's just something you do when you have millions of dollars, I guess. Where in multiple cities he spent and gave away so much gold that it upset the city's economies. That is a big flex. Okay. Donald Trump might have hotels, but Mansa Musa has everything else. It's kind of like Monopoly when one player has a boatload of cash and they go from one good property to the next. So if they land on something, they get all the cold hard cash to deal with it. Plus, they also have some good property and they just make it back every turn anyway. I'm fed up with Monopoly.
Number 4. King of Castles. King Ludwig II had numerous castles built to resemble fairy tale castles. Yeah, let's call this inspiration, I guess. What a privilege this ought to be. Ludwig was only 18 when he became the King of Bavaria back in 1864, and then he had castles built as, he was inspired from romantic literature and spending time at the opera. You hear that, Andrew? He was inspired after the opera. What a poet.
It's crazy.
Crazy. Must be nice, right? King Ludwig II would spend his nights in one castle, looking through his fancy telescope, admiring the next castle being built. What? He even freestyled the castle as well. Yeah, just 4 years in, the guy designed his own majestical castle. And to this day, it's one of the most photographed places in the world, so clearly he did something right. Neuschwanstein Castle, literal fairy tale, there we go. Meanwhile, I'm over here making castles in Minecraft. Still fun, we'll take it.
Number 3, jousting. First there is bread, and then there is wine, and then there is entertainment. You can't tell me while a delicious plate of nachos dances like a ballerina in your microwave, you didn't pull up some super cool content to watch on your phone. Maybe featuring a large, kinda funny comedian, and maybe also featuring a super handsome, tall, funny comedian with a neck thing, I don't know. Kings of ye olde times did not possess the power of the internet or watching fail videos, so watching combat sports was the next best thing. Oh, what's that I hear? Watching the sport isn't enough? Well, some royalty even got involved. King Henry VIII, for example, just loved to joust because he did. He even had an accident with such, and it's what might have made him gone mad in the first place.
Number 2, banning coffee. This is the worst of the worst, people. Here we go. Murad IV, Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the guy banned coffee. What a monster. I would be asleep right now if coffee wasn't a thing. He was born in 1612, and for the most part, his mother was ruling through him because he was so young and all. But when he got a little older, he got a little wiser, he put forth these laws, punishable by death, may I add, in order to get things back on track. That was the key. The guy banned coffee, tobacco, and alcohol. What a fun guy. He would actually disguise himself as a civilian at nighttime and then wander around aimlessly in hopes that he would find one of these dark roast renegades just wandering the roads. If you were caught outside having a quick smoke break, you weren't arrested, you didn't get fined, but rather Murad IV himself would just take off his hood and be like, surprise, and then he would take off your head. Right there in the streets. No trial, no jury, just straight to execution. All that for some stale ale. What a monster.
Number 1, groom of the stool. For some reason, this job was considered to be higher up, a well-respected job, if you will. However, I'd like to ask the man in charge of such an operation how he felt. I can imagine he wasn't too fond of his job. Hands never clean, hands never cleaned. The groom of the stool is someone who would assist the king in his bathroom duties by supplying fresh water, towels, and whatever a king needs. He may have also been responsible for cleaning the forbidden starfish. May the divines of Skyrim have mercy on his soul. I guess this had to be done, but I don't know if I could ever even do that to another human being. If you've ever eaten Taco Bell late at night and washed it down with some Baja Blast, then you know the kind of explosion awaits the porcelain throne in the morning. So yes, having a servant present at your bowel movements is a privilege that most other folks just didn't have, but would you really want one?
But kicking off the list at number 10, must love licorice. Okay, we'll start off a little tame. Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous French emperor, the famous military leader from the 1800s. Napoleon Bonaparte was responsible for conquering a large part of Europe. Bet you didn't know he was obsessed with licorice though. Way too much. He would eat this all day, every day. Ugh, it feels gross. Look, as somebody who can't stand licorice, I already feel bad for Josephine. Licorice breath at any time of the day coming your way? No, no thank you. I'll hard pass. Napoleon carried licorice around with him at all times. This guy ate so much of it, his teeth became stained. They turned black. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, it's black licorice too. Not the strawberry pull and peels, those are great. I'm talking about 1800s black licorice. It would come in lozenges. If somebody offered me a lozenge and it was black licorice, I'd call the police. Smack it out of their hands. Number 9, George IV. When it was time for King George III to pass on the crown, of course, next in line, heir to the throne, is his eldest son, also named George. What if you became king in 1820? Would you be noble? Would you do monologues in the sunset as you enriched your homeland? Kings like to do that a lot with their if I had the hair still. Or would you do what King George IV did and make horrible financial decisions every single day? The guy would just party all day as well. He would gamble every day, he would buy expensive stuff that he did not need, and on top of that, he would never do any of his royal duties. Guy wouldn't do his job. His father had to step in, classic. He figured the only way to settle all these new debts set in motion by George IV, in order to clear those up, George now has to marry his cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. The arranged marriage happened April 8th, 1795, and what was supposed to be a happy day for all was a nightmare for all included. They hated each other as soon as they met. I mean, obviously, he was a fool. George got heavily intoxicated for the wedding. He was just hammered the entire time. And then 9 months later, almost to the day, they had a child. And then right after that happened, they went their separate ways. So yeah, horribly unhealthy relationship. Once George became king in 1820, he then tried to divorce her. Like, what a fool. Just let it go. Let it all go. Let her go. Number 8, Filippo Maria Visconti. The Duke of Milan during the 14th century was at first Gian Maria Visconti, but after he was taken out, his brother, Filippo Maria Visconti, had to step up to the bat. As a ruler, Filippo was better. His brother had been cruel previously, hence the untimely departure. So this was a good move at first, so we thought. Now Filippo had to take over come 1412. Filippo was better than his brother on paper. He helped reorganize government finances. He got the silk industry up and running, which we love that. He ended up passing away of natural causes down the road, which is, nothing like his brother. But while he was in power, he never showed his face to anybody, not even people close to him. He hid in his palace most of the time, and it was odd because he thought that he was ugly. That's why he hid his face. Kind of sad, right? Filippo hid his face, and maybe you feel bad for him now, right? Just a little bit. He died of natural causes and he was alone all that time. Yeah, don't feel bad for him. This guy was horrible. He was jealous of his wife Beatrice Lascaris de Tenda because she was twice his age, twice as smart, and twice as powerful. So Filippo had her taken out in a courtyard publicly September 13th, 1418. Yeah, he accused her of adultery just cause he could, and he had some suspicions in his dark room by himself hiding his face. History is ugly, and sometimes it's literally ugly as well. Boy. Number 7, Queen Caroline. Queen Caroline. Ba ba ba. She went out in a horrible way. We can't sing about her. History remembers Queen Caroline for the way that she went out. It was bad. It was actually written down in an epigram attributed to the 18th century poet Alexander Pope. Here lies wrapped up in 40,000 towels, the only proof that Caroline had bowels. Again, it rhymes. Why is everything rhyming? This is so awful. Who can be like, yeah, write that down, that's good, that's good. Wait. It does rhyme, that's good, yeah, checks out. Rest in peace. My gosh, her husband, he was certainly no help at all. Caroline was previously married to George IV, and this guy locked her out of Westminster on Coronation Day. So yeah, she went out in a horrible way, but let's not forget the marriage that came beforehand. That wasn't pleasant either. Nothing in this guy or this marriage was pleasant. Number 6, Henry VIII. Of course he's back. He had 6 wives, and it was pretty much entirely bad for all of them, yeah. It was the late 1400s. Henry took the throne in 1509. This guy was only 17 years old when all this madness began to unfold. Only days after the execution of Anne, who I mentioned on part 1 of this list, so days after he married his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour's mothers were first cousins, so they were close, and during all of this, they of course went head to head more than once. Jane died shortly after giving birth to Edward VI on October 12, 1537. I can't mention King Henry's wives and leave a couple out. This is just a history channel. We have to mention all of them, okay? Number 5, George V. Turned out this guy loved stamps. Maybe a bit too much though, I'd say. It was almost distracting. It was taking up many hours of his day. Like, focus on other things, like say maybe, I don't know, the war. King George V continued to collect stamps during World War I. Everyone's trying to stay alive. George is just in the background like, Like all collections, they started at an early age. It's now at a point where it's just, past impressive and borderline strange. Especially if you're a royal, like you're really going hard with this. This guy had albums on albums of stamps. He had around 330 albums, each was 60 pages, full of stamps. That's 20,000 pages full of stamps. That's a lot, way too many stamps. So naturally, he was nicknamed the King of Stamps, or rather the King of Philately. That's the official term for collecting stamps. We're historians here, we have to make it official. Back in 1905, he set an all-time stamp record, the most money ever spent on a stamp. This guy dropped like 220,000 on one single stamp. Somebody even asked the prince down the road if he had heard about the fool who had spent 1,400 pounds on a stamp. And he was proud. He was like, oh, that fool? It was I. Number 4. Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor from 1552. He was known as a collector. Yeah, some princes collected stamps, others collect zoo animals. We're all different. Yeah, his castle was home to lions, tigers, and not bears, but orangutans, so good luck getting your 8 hours. He also collected human artifacts, like body parts after they've been, so that's watch your step, I guess. Welcome to MTV Cribs, don't mind the jar of eyes, watch out for the lion's tail, careful, what a mess. He's quite important in history though, I guess. He supported the scientific revolution, and he also poured tons of money into astrology, so next time you read your horoscope, remember it's Bones in the Jar Benny that's responsible for that one. And also, in case you're wondering, yeah, he didn't pay attention to any of his wives or anything like that. He was just, no, jars for me, jars animals, I'm all set. Number 3, Don Carlos. Spanish Crown Prince, the guy who just enjoyed being the worst human alive. Let's talk about him. Back in the mid-1500s, the eldest son to King Philip II of Spain was, yeah, I want to say worse things, but he was just a really bad person. YouTube, he was just a bad guy. Now, it's been noted that he was born with a hunchback and one leg was shorter than the other. Historians like to bring that up first, and how maybe he had the odds against him with these disabilities growing up, and people often feel bad for him a little. To that I say, don't. Nah, don't do it. Don Carlos was made hero of the opera by his dad. Dude was fine. Philip II of Spain? Yeah, he would hurt a lot of people. He would hurt animals and people just for fun. According to historians, Don Carlos once made a cobbler eat a pair of boots because he didn't like how the pair of boots looked. He made somebody eat boots. We're not gonna feel bad for him on Bumblebee today. That's not what we're gonna do. He was also set up to marry Queen Elizabeth of Valois, the eldest daughter of King Henry II, but after a few hours, she was like, no, that's not gonna happen, no way. So she married his father instead. That's what happens. That's what happens when you're In 1564, a few brides were lined up for Don Carlos. Mary, Queen of Scots, was one of them. Margaret of Valois, we know what happened with her, and Anna of Austria. But his mental conditions grew worse and it went south. Shocker. Number 2, Heart of Glass. King Charles VI, once nicknamed the Beloved and then quickly nicknamed the Mad. What happened? After he became King of France in 1380, he would have these episodes, let's call them. He would believe he was made of glass and he didn't want anybody to touch him. He had this glass delusion, which was surprisingly not uncommon, believe it or not, for this time period. Believing you were made out of glass in some way, shape, or form, be it in your head, butt, shoulders, or back, really spiked around the mid-1400s, and Charles VI, aka Charles the Mad, he wouldn't let anybody, not even his wife, near him at all. I'm not making fun of somebody for having a fear like that. I mean, most likely historians believe he was schizophrenic, so obviously I'm not ripping on that. But Alexandria of Bavaria, another royal who had this glass delusion, she too believed she had swallowed a grand piano made of glass, so she had to enter rooms sideways to avoid it shattering. I don't know what's going on with this glass delusion, but I'm glad it went away. I don't know. And finally, number 1, King George IV. Voted as England's worst king by historians, so that should already tell you a good amount of this guy. George was another one of those monarchs who was a little too invested in his, intimate side quests, if you know what I'm saying here, like all these other kings we've talked about. He was a bit busy, being a stupid fool. This man was trying literally everything to get a woman to sleep with him. Although he was the king and he was already set up, he was like, nope, I'm gonna go and keep trying with strangers and random. And he would throw a tantrum if they said no, or he would threaten to end his own life if he didn't get the girl. Like, you know what I'm saying? One of those kind of monsters. He would also keep trophies, lack of a better term, of all these conquests afterwards. He would ask each people that he slept with for a little piece of hair, and then he would keep them. He would store them. Back then it was kind of common, I guess, for lovers to keep locks of each other's hair. Weirdly enough, because you don't have phone numbers or like any sort of way to remember someone, photos, I don't know. So you kept their hair. But after the king died, his brother found 7,000 envelopes, each with a lock of hair that was, quote, enough to stuff a sofa. End quote. So yeah, I'll leave you on that note.
At number 10, royal enemas. Apparently, back in the day, enemas were all the rage amongst the elite. It was believed that enemas were good for your health, so everyone was doing it to try and live a little longer than the rest of those commoners and peasants. One person who really just couldn't get enough enemas in his life was King Louis XIV. It is believed that over the course of his life, Louis XIV received thousands of enemas. When I tell you this guy was obsessed, I'm not kidding. One year, Louis received 212 enemas in just the 1 year. And of course, he had to make his enemas a little jazzy and couldn't just use water like any other person. Oh no. My guy was using things like almond milk. His enemas were also sometimes scented with orange or rose, and sometimes even colored just to make it a little more special. To get an idea of just how obsessed the elite were with receiving enemas, just think about the fact that a French duchess once received one during a court ball. The duchess was in the middle of having a conversation with Louis XIV, and during this conversation, one of her maids came over, snuck under her dress, and gave the duchess an enema on the spot. Ew. These people were so weird. At number 9, pampered pony. I'm sure I can speak for most people when I say when you have a pet, you love and care for that thing like it is your child, right? Well, one Roman emperor might have taken that concept a little bit too far, because saying that he was obsessed with his horse is an understatement. The Roman emperor known as Caligula had a horse named Incitatus. Caligula was a horse racing enthusiast, so Incitatus was his pride and joy, and not too many people were all that thrilled about it, to be honest. When I tell you this horse was treated better than most people have ever been, I'm not kidding. The horse's stall was made out of marble, his manger was made out of ivory, and he was even fed oats flaked with gold. Caligula was also very adamant about his horse receiving a good and restful sleep before a race, and he was so serious about it that he made guards stand outside of the horse's stable to make sure that the horse remained undisturbed while it slept. This horse even had its own furniture. Like, what is he gonna do with it? He's a horse. Caligula was so fond of his horse that he even made it a priest and promised to make him consul, which was the lead position in the Roman government after the emperor, highly coveted by senators. This was the last straw for people because the emperor was putting his horse above his own people, so he was assassinated. Now, before I carry on telling you guys about the wild and crazy things that kings did back in the day, I would like to first ask you guys to consider leaving a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far, and also maybe think about subscribing as well to see more videos like this one. At number 8, Mumia medicine. It's safe to say that medicine from the past is very different from modern times. These days we have pharmaceuticals to treat illnesses, but back in the days of old there were very different and quite questionable methods of treating ailments, and one of those methods included cannibalism. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it was common practice for elites like priests, kings, and other nobles to consume remedies that included human bones, blood, and fat as medicine to treat ailments from headaches to epilepsy, and this practice was called mumia medicine. At first, it started with people using Egyptian mummies and skulls from Irish graves for use in medicine, as bones would be ground and used in different tinctures for various uses. But soon, other parts of the body started to be used. Human fat was later used to treat ailments on the outside of the body, and blood would be consumed as well, as it was believed to contain the vitality of life. Several monarchs were known to use mumia medicine, like Charles II and William II of England, Francois I of France, and Christian IV of Denmark.
Number 7, George I. King George I, couple of Georges on this list, okay? Long before his British ruling days, George was in Germany. He was actually the elector there, and he'd been married before around 1682. Originally, he married Sophia Dorothea of Seal, but the entire time they were married, it was horrible. George would straight up bring other women home because he just felt like he could. Like he literally argued that he could, given his role. He's like, oh, I could have these women and we could do all this in front of you. Of course, I'm this person of this. Like, no, you're a fool. You're a jerk, really. He would have numerous mistresses and he would purposely flaunt them. So Sophia thought, okay, if you can have numerous side hustles going on, I'll move on myself. So she began seeing a Swedish count. Okay. She began seeing Philip Christoph von Königsmark. Now when George inevitably found out, he was violent at this point. He was upset, he divorced Sophia and then imprisoned her. Yeah, when he became king of Britain later on in 1714, she didn't come with him. Yeah, it's not just horrible with Sophia either. The Duke had also been taken out, sadly. His love for Sophia ended up getting him killed. What a mess. All these Georges are so messy, the worst. If your name's George, don't be a mess, just be nice. Hit that thumbs up if you're a George. Change the game. Change the stats up. Number 6, heir to the throne. Okay, I kicked out this list roasting Napoleon and his licorice choices, but of course, he's done much worse things than have bad breath and stained teeth. Napoleon's marriage to Josephine was first fueled by love and friendship, but things quickly changed. Marie Josephine Rosé Tacher de la Pagerie was born in 1763. She had 2 children with her first husband, but that marriage was also not a happy time. They separated, and Josephine met Napoleon in 1795. Napoleon at this point was married at the time, and they had an affair, and they were deeply in love, like actually in love, and Napoleon proposed to Josephine in 1796, and they married later that year. 2 days after their wedding, Napoleon led the French army in Italy, and while he was gone, both of them ended up having affairs. So many affairs in this. Like, does love even exist? What the hell? 1804, Napoleon crowned himself and then crowned Josephine, proclaiming her empress. A few years passed, and after finding out Josephine couldn't bear any more children, Napoleon made a list of possible and eligible princesses. Just a list, and just left it out. Like, how awful is that? In November 1809, Josephine agreed to the divorce, and come 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte's final word on his deathbed was Josephine. Yeah, a little darker than licorice, just a tad. Number 5, King Henry VIII. The second wife of King Henry VIII. She was found guilty of treason, and she had been charged with having relationships with 5 others, including Lord Rochford, aka her brother, George Boleyn. She had also apparently had relations with Sir Henry Norris, the king's close friend, and when I say close, I mean they were really close. He was the groom of the stool. So they were close, and on top of this, Anne was also found guilty of conspiring to kill her husband. I wonder why. This list will explain a few reasons. Now, it's since been proven that these crimes were a bunch of rubbish. Anne wasn't present when these events even went down. She was still recovering from the birth of her daughter, future Elizabeth I, so there's no way she was fooling around with the groom of the stool in October 1533, Your Honor. All 5 guys involved were executed on Tower Hill May 1536, and then 2 days later, Anne joked about her own little neck before being taken out with the sword herself. Yeah, all dark. There wasn't even a coffin for her burial. Somebody had to get an old elm chest from the Tower Armory. How horrible is that? Number 4, a bit better. Another one of King Henry VIII's wives, Anne of Cleves. Where do we even begin here? This one is, honestly, this one's pretty sad, man. Anne was right in the middle of Henry's wives. She was married to King Henry for 6 months, and it was seen as quite strategic in a way. Henry's chief minister convinced him to marry one of the sisters of Germany's Duke of Cleves, either Anne or Amelia. So in order to decide, King Henry requested that Hans Holbein travel to Cleves to paint a portrait of each sister, and then come back and compare them. This is like the birth of Tinder. I'm not even joking, this is how he did it. This man compared portraits and then chose Anne because every man praiseth her beauty. Yeah, compared her to the silver moon. Yeah, try that on a dating site, write that in. I praiseth thou beauty, madam, to a silver dollar. A silver sea sand dollar shining in the moon. What? I don't know, just click it. Click send and see what happens. Then a treaty was signed. A few weeks later, Anne arrived to England, and Henry was beyond upset because she looked nothing like the portrait, apparently. How horrible is that? You look nothing like this Victorian painting. How dare you? It's 6 a.m. and you've been riding a horse for 4 weeks and you don't look like this Victorian painting? Shame. He tried to stop the wedding, but it was too late at that point, so they had to follow through. And on January 6, 1540, their marriage was official. You can't unswipe this marriage, rich boy. Anne later accepted the divorce gladly and then lived as the king's sister peacefully until her death in 1557. Number 3, Christian VII. Christian, there's an ironic name for what I'm about to tell you. The prince that couldn't keep his hands out of his pants. I don't know how else to say it. Here we go. Christian VII of Denmark. He was a young lad. He was spoiled. He was a little comfortable with his body, maybe too comfortable, and he would often just have his hands in his pants hanging out. He was like one of those, rich king. He was kind of like Joffrey from Game of Thrones. He would just sit back and like suck on candy and stuff and just, fool around. I don't know, it's gross. Middle of dinner, this guy would pass around food to his family with those gross hands. He would alternate hands and pants to handing out food. What a little twerp. Now, it's unknown, but historians believe maybe, just maybe, he was a tad mad. Who's to tell? Either way, don't touch the rye bread, Christian. Thanks. Go wash your hands. Twice. Number 2, King Henry VIII. Again. Of course, we have to talk about Henry VIII again. He's pretty bad, not gonna lie. Henry VIII was King of England from 1509 to 1547. He's been married a handful of times, as we've heard by now, and all of them have went south. When Henry married Catherine, he was 49. She was a few years younger. She was actually a lot younger, classic 1500s. Way too young. And when they got married, Henry was not the same as he was when they had met. He had received a nasty jousting wound, so now he was gravely overweight. He didn't do anything, he just laid around all day and complained. So Catherine, of course, just wanted some, shred of a life, and being again quite young, too young, she decided to look for love. Well, God forbid you try and have a life in the 1500s, because then the young queen was accused of having an affair and was publicly and horribly taken out in the courtyard. And finally, coming in at number 1, Henry II. The relationship between Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine is pretty memorable. It's memorable in all the wrong ways, of course. When they first met, things were good, dare I say, with both of them. They were both young, and he was going to be king. He was young, king, guy, young man who's going to be king. And Eleanor, she was married, but once she got an annulment, their love was good. Their love was good and young and ready to be young king stuff. After the annulment in 1152, Henry and Eleanor tied the knot officially a couple weeks after. Love moves quickly, apparently. Henry started having affairs, because of course he did. At this point in this list, we're not gasping at affairs, sadly. But come 1173, Eleanor had convinced their sons to go against father. Yeah, Henry didn't take this well, and he had Eleanor locked up for 16 years. He had died, so after that point she had resumed the royal roles, because at this point those two boys had grown up and inherited the throne, Richard and John. But being locked up for that long, what a nightmare that relationship was entirely. I figured we'd end on a kind of tame one where she kind of came back and it was good. Kind of good, dare I say? I don't know. Kicking off the list at number 10, a goodnight kiss. We'll start off funny, okay? History can be funny sometimes, even when it's not meant to be, and it's meant to be completely serious. I can't help but read this information and laugh. Royals were sweating constantly about people trying to take them out, of course. I mentioned Boy Jones on here a few times. That guy stalked the queen over and over for years. Historically, these royals have been on the lookout for enemies, and the way that they prevent these attacks, yeah, sometimes it can be a little funny. Like the kissing sheets, for example. Have you heard about this weird position in the castle? What an odd job this is. A great deal of monarchs hired taste testers to make sure nobody poisoned their ale, which is, pretty lousy job there. Either having a good day or a bad day, no in between. But they also had a guy kiss the king's sheets every day, He just kissed the entire bed. The king size, may I remind you, massive bed. King Henry VIII, this guy hired somebody to literally just go in, get snuggled up, and just make sure the king's bed wasn't poisoned. There's nothing on it that's gonna make the skin go all ouchy. But he would just get in his bed and just go to sleep for a bit. You are required to make the king's bed every morning, of course, and before he gets back in, you gotta get in and kiss that bed, man. You gotta kiss that bed real good. Mwah, mwah, let's go. Mwah. All right, time to clock out for the day. Mwah, one more for good luck. Clothes as well, that was touched. Maybe not kissed, but it was for sure worn and touched. It's so weird. Guys wearing my clothes in my bed. No way, I'd rather get poisoned. Like, yo, take my jeans off. Who is that guy? Get back here. Like, imagine marrying that king and it's like, oh, hang on, before we get snugged in, this guy has to go and kiss your sheets. She's like, ew, what? Why does my sheets smell like breath? Everything smells like breath. Number 9, enemas. We gotta talk about perhaps one of the worst sights to see in the household. Back in the olden days, enemas were the talk of the town. Well, rather the palace. Like most things in the 1400s, only the rich could afford the enema supplies, specifically King Louis XIV. Guy loved enemas. Just big old fan of enemas. It's believed that over the course of his life, Louis XIV received thousands of enemas. Thousands. It's a lot of decimals. Decimals for enemas. In just 1 year, Louis received 212 enemas. Like, guy, that's like 112 too much, I'd say. I don't know. He would always take it a step further, and dare I say, a step fancier, by using almond milk for the enemas. Imagine being married to a guy and he pulls out almond milk and you're like, oh no, not again. Come on, Louis, please, I just ate. Number 8, no bathing in this house. Bathing in the olden days wasn't fully understood, if that makes any sense. Like in a medical book, in an official 16th century medical book, the medical advice was, use not baths or stews, nor sweat too much, for all openeth the pores of a man's body, and maketh the venomous air to enter and for to infect the blood. First of all, huh? What? What does it even mean? Why is every shred of medical knowledge always written in riddles? God forbid you have bronchitis in the 16th century. A doctor would just be like, ah yes, just a drop of ale and a witch's flick and you'll be on your way. Like, what? Do you have any halls? Help me. Help me, dude. No, I'm just mad. Bro, I have pneumonia. I need medicine. So of course they thought that taking a bath would make you sick. Of course. So King James IV, apparently this guy never took a bath in his life. And his hygiene was so bad that he would sometimes pass lice to others just by being in the same room that he was earlier. So not at the same time, he would come in, do his king stuff, leave, and the lice would be like, pew! And they would just wait in that room and get on someone else. That's so gross. That's horrible. Lice would emit off this man. He's like the stinky kid from Charlie Brown with the stinky cloud. That's just like lice around this guy. Margaret Tudor was married to King James. Yeah, must have loved the no bathing thing, eh?
Number 7, midlife crisis. This one's kind of generalized because if I didn't, I'd have to mention almost every king ever. So here we go. Back in ye olde times, the access to better healthcare just wasn't there. Doctors aren't washing hands. Imagine, Buddy eats some greasy mutton and then says, "Alright, time for your enema." But those aren't the only greasy hands around certain orifices I'm talking about. I'm talking about kings marrying older girls at the ripe age of 12. Yep, that's right. Nothing says experience in womanhood like being 12. People didn't live long, and oftentimes these arranged marriages had ulterior motives, like alliances or business really. However, that does not make up for marrying a 12-year-old who may or may not have started those super weird changing times, like when you were 12 and now there's hair showing up in places that you didn't know there could be hair. I sent a courier to the chief and he came back with this message. It ain't it. Number 6, till death do us part. Love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage, but sometimes the crooning words of Frank Sinatra aren't enough to keep people in love. Sometimes marriages end up like the ones we see on sitcoms, but when there's no laugh track, it's not very funny, and sometimes divorce is the answer. Medieval Germans thought this too, and something they practiced was divorce by combat. Basically, the man goes into a hole with his arm tied behind his back, and the woman is free to move around with a sack of rocks. These proceedings are strange, as I'm sure no husband or wife married today would ever get so frustrated with one another that they would want to hit one another on the head with rocks. Oh, the blessings of being married. Number 5, domestic disturbance. William the Conqueror was one down bad dude. The illegitimate ruler to the throne left a bad taste in some people's mouths, and was just as ruthless in silencing those rebellions that were always uprising against him as he was with the famous battles he was a part of, like the Battle of Hastings. But what I think he should be remembered by is the way he asked Matilda to marry him, or rather the extreme measures he took when she refused his advances because he was an illegitimate leader. William dragged Matilda by the hair out into the middle of the street and beat her until she agreed to marry him. I don't have to tell you how messed up that is, and I sure hope I don't. Number 4, Nero Sauna. The Romans were kind of a big deal, especially if you're into history. Large city, culture, and some other structures are still around today. That's kinda cool. But while the city of Rome may have been the best city on earth at the time, Romans themselves could use a little work. Meet Emperor Nero, the vicious leader of Rome who became emperor through ill-gotten gains. However, in what may have been one of the first acts of flexing the male patriarchy, the divorce, or forced separation of his wife Claudia Octavia, comes to mind. It was a rocky marriage from the start. There was a general dislike from the very beginning, but when Nero remarried, as emperors did, he had Octavia banished to an island, where shortly after she would be suffocated in a hot vapor bath. Her demise was sad for most Romans. Oh yeah, and they tried to make it look like she did herself in. That's messed up, man. Number 3, pedestal. I think in a healthy relationship, you ought to put your partner on a pedestal sometimes. Maybe your partner is drop dead gorgeous, a promising athlete, really enjoys collecting stamps. You go, little rock star, collect those presidential stamps. However, Emperor Caligula of Rome had some other ideas. He would literally put his wife, who he claimed to love, up on a pedestal stark naked, and let his friends in the military gawk and glare at her. He would also say to her that he could end her life whenever he wanted, and put a knife against her for no reason. Weird flex, but okay. This guy was awful to everyone, as he tormented and unalived so many people. Well, you sure wouldn't want to see his face everywhere, as he liked to do just that. Built statues of himself everywhere because after losing your family to his tyranny and looking at his wife, you need to know who's responsible for all this. That's messed up. Number 2, Duzong Duzong Duzong. That wouldn't really be a great fraternity name, would it? Well, the Emperor of Duzong of China would think differently, as when he was in charge, That's pretty much what the royal court looked like. Enough drinking to keep AA in meetings for 100 years, and enough ladies of the evening to... Well, I don't have a joke for this one, but there were a lot of them, trust me. Having massive parties like that and enjoying the company of other women is not how you respect your wife. To make matters worse, it seemed that too much partying may have been a bad thing. Who would have thought? As what he made up for in a fun weekend, he lacked in governing, as the Mongols were at his front door, or gate rather. Eventually, his empire would burn to the ground. All thanks to alcohol, and many women who laid down for their lives, literally. Number 1, side piece. Look, I enjoy the company of a woman just as much as the next king sits on his throne. But in my opinion, once you find a wife, it's time to settle down, relax, no more crazy parties like Duzong. This is another generalization, but every king did this. Every king in the past has had mistresses, as if that is a totally okay thing to do to your wife and oftentimes the queen of your kingdom. I'm a reasonable guy, so maybe I can see having your side piece waiting in the wings to be stage center, but it's never one, is it? It's always multiple. Ladies of the past, all I can say is make sure you give birth to a boy and watch your back. They're coming for it. Number 10. No one's ever really gone. You may have heard that said when losing a family member, a pet, or in the worst Star Wars movies ever made. Sorry, not sorry Disney, those are terrible. But perhaps there is someone who is never really gone. Genghis Khan. Yes, that's right. The ruthless Mongol warrior who conquered so much in his time that we're still talking about it today. So why is this big bad warrior still with us today? Well, that's because of DNA. Yeah, in his time there was lots of activities going on, besides the usual pillaging the village and unaliving those who oppose you. There were a lot of happy endings, let's say, and by that I mean forced non-YouTube friendly conduct bedroom happy endings. So much so that when a study was conducted back in 2003, 8% of men in Asia were thought to be descendants of the mighty man himself. 0.5% worldwide. That doesn't sound like a lot, but we're talking about millions of people here. Next time you go out, you may be brushing shoulders with the warrior's kin. Prepare for battle. Number 9. Henry again? Boy, it's really hard not to talk about this guy. But dude was kinda down bad for it. He's just most well known for his mistreatment of his wives, and by mistreatment, I don't mean getting into a fight over whether or not the toilet seat should be up or down and then having a very toxic argument in front of family members. No, because when Henry was upset with marriage, he wanted divorce, which honestly was kind of taboo for the time. Oh yeah, and he also beheaded 2 of his wives because that's how it goes. I know every couple has their issues to work out, but for most dads out there, having sun-drenched beer-fueled weekends, they never go beheading after that. Although, Dad's been staring at the lawnmower for a while and there's a lot of blades on that. Dad? While it is true King Henry VIII did behead 2 wives, he didn't do it to all of them. And at some points we're honestly quite pleased with his holy sanctity of marriage. Anyone who's ever been married can tell you how peaceful and sacred that bond really is. Number 8. The People's Princess. Okay, I know Prince Charles isn't exactly a king, but he is royalty and the man kinda did Diana dirty. That's a quick and half put together allusion to a Michael Jackson song for the English majors and the audience. Being royalty isn't easy. Being royalty in a modern age when paparazzi overwhelm you with lights and cameras just for a juicy piece of gossip like, when was your last bowel movement? Is it slow? Extra extra, read all about it, the princess is constipated. That's just not fun. So after Prince Charles and Princess Diana had been married for a few years, you can understand how excited the media was to find out about their marital disputes. There was 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded, was a quote by Princess Diana that gave the media a field day. Sadly, Prince Charles was having an affair, and it wouldn't be too much longer that Diana would perish in a car accident that may or may not be organized by the royal family themselves.
At number 7, kissing sheets. For thousands of years, monarchs worried about the threat of being poisoned by their enemies, and so they thought of an array of precautions to take in order to prevent being taken out by some kind of spicy death sauce or something. Many monarchs hired tasters to try their food before before it was given to the king to make sure that it wasn't poisoned, but some monarchs were also afraid of being poisoned through something that they touched. This is why Henry VIII hired someone with a very important job to make sure that his bed wasn't poisoned. The person who was tasked with making the king's bed was also required to kiss every part of his bed in the morning. They would kiss the pillows, sheets, and blankets to prove that someone hadn't smeared poison on it. The king was also concerned with people poisoning clothing too, so his clothes as well as his son's clothes were also tested for poison before getting dressed. At number 6, eternal youth. I know that there are a lot of people out there who want to live forever. I am one of those people. I am afraid of dying, but I also want to see what humanity will look like many years from now until the sun consumes the earth. Unfortunately, that's kind of impossible, at least for now, until we come up with some kind of way to make people live longer. But this idea of prolonging your life has been around for thousands of years, and one Chinese emperor was super obsessed with the idea and really tried his best to live for at least another 10,000 years. Emperor Ying Zhang was obsessed with finding a magic elixir that would make him live longer, and he demanded that his subjects find this immortality elixir for him. Now, even though he brought a lot of prosperity to people during his rule, he never let go of his demand for immortality, and it put a lot of pressure on his underlings to find him something to help him live forever, but obviously that didn't happen. He was so concerned with his lifespan that he even brought magicians into his court. His obsession alienated him from his people, and after all of that effort trying to live longer, he died at the age of 49. At number 5, no bathing. These days, bathing is kind of a necessary thing. Gotta be clean, you have to smell nice, you have to practice proper hygiene. But back in the olden days, this was the complete opposite, and nobles rarely ever bathed, and it was kind of a trend. Over time, physicians began to believe that bathing was dangerous, and obviously the nobility tried to protect their lives and well-being at all costs, and so they just stopped bathing. In a popular 16th century medical book, it was advised, quote, "Use not baths or stews nor sweat too much, for all openeth pores of a man's body maketh the venomous air to open and for to infect the blood," end quote. So yeah, they thought that taking a bath would make you sick. In the late 15th century, Queen Isabella of Spain would go around bragging about the fact that she had only ever bathed twice in her whole life. Weird flex, but okay. King James IV apparently never bathed, and his hygiene was so bad that he passed on lice to other people who went into a room that was frequented by the king. He also never washed his hands before eating and would just rub his fingers with the wet end of a napkin. These people were gross. At number 4, prankster king. You know that you're a spoiled king when you can pull pranks on people constantly and never have anyone try and stop you or fight back. This was basically the life of King Christian VII of Denmark, who was known for being pretty childish and playing pranks on people his whole life. He was a troublemaker through and through. He was known to play pranks on his grandmother by putting pins in her throne, and he would throw things at her, and he even ran through the streets with his friend and his mistress, destroying shops and patronizing brothels. He even made his own torture rack, had himself tied to it, and flogged. Why? I have an idea, but I don't want to think about that one too hard. One of the other weird things that he was known to do was leapfrog over dignitaries when they would bow to him. This guy was really quite immature. At number 3, saints in bed. I understand the desire to feel protected by whatever gods or saints you might believe in. That's one of the whole points of religion. However, I think some people can take that idea a little bit too far, and by some people I mean the Spanish royal family. These guys took religion very seriously, and they believed that following religion heavily would allow God to heal them when they were sick. So, when a member of the royal family was ill, doctors would remove body parts or even entire corpses of saints from churches and monasteries and would put them in bed with the person who was ill. Yeah, they slept with the corpses of dead saints to be healed of their sickness. Could you imagine if that was still how medicine was practiced today? At number 2, rat court-martial. There has been a record of many kings throughout history who were complete children through and through. Even though many of them grew into adulthood, they still acted immature, and one of the greatest examples of that was Peter III of Russia. He was not a good ruler or a good husband to his wife, who would later become Catherine the Great. Peter spent every night in bed with her playing toy soldiers because he was obsessed with his little dolls. He was so obsessed, in fact, that when a rat chewed the head off one of his toy soldiers, he was so upset that he held a proper military court-martial for the rat. He proclaimed the rat guilty of treason and had it hung in a tiny gallows that he had built for the occasion. It was weird, but in the end that bizarre event helped Catherine overthrow her husband, so I guess it kind of worked out for someone. And finally, at number 1, groom of the stool. Guys, I found the worst job in history. You think working at the 1-star Domino's Pizza in your neighborhood is bad? Wait until you find out about the groom of the stool. The groom of the stool was a job created during the reign of Henry VIII, where the role was to monitor and assist the king in his bowel movements. They would carry around a commode at all times, and they were also tasked with monitoring the king's diet and meal times, and would organize the king's days around his break times. They were also tasked with undressing the king for him to do his business, and it's also been suggested that they would have had to, quote, cleanse the royal posterior as well. Sounds like a pretty crappy job to me, but I'm not funny, I'll leave. Before I wrap things up for today, I want you guys to leave a comment down below telling me if you were the ruler of a country, what is the first thing that you would do in your new position of power? I think I would probably make college free because that ish is expensive and no one needs that kind of debt in their lives. I'm still paying off mine.
We gonna start with, why are you so stingy? You literally live in a castle. You have gold doubloons like an effing pirate, priceless spices stolen from foreign lands, and gemstones harvested fresh from the earth. But you're gonna have us measure every loaf of bread so they're the exact same? Back in the late 1500s, Viscount Montagu demanded meticulous records of every expenditure. The clerk of the kitchen was a crossbreed between an extreme couponer and a professional nitpicker, who had to provide the cooks with the ingredients for every meal in exact amounts for each person to be served, and ensure that each plate had the exact same weight and proportions laid upon it. Among his many duties was also to ensure every wheat loaf that went in the oven weighed 18 ounces and was 16 ounces when it was taken out. What happens if they weighed more or less? Off to the bread breaking wheel, or maybe the sourdough slow slicer, off to the steak for a little French toasting, Anyway, for how the British monarchy would pitch a fit over a 3-letter word, children, not kids, because we all want to speak a little bit more like Mary Poppins. Oh yes, little children, off to bed we go. Nah, dude, I couldn't do the whole royal nanny thing, to be honest. The education required enough makes you think that they're scouting for NASA, not someone to stop their kid from picking its nose, publicly at least. Maria Borello, the nanny who takes care of Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, trained at the notable Norland College in Bath, England, before being hired to the world's most famous children. At this college, students like Borello study early years development for 3 years. However, as well as learning social and emotional development, students are also taught the importance of vocabulary. There is one word that royal nannies are prohibited from using to describe royal children: kids. Ask me why. Come on. Ask me. It's because of the exact honky-dory dumbass reason you think. It's the baby goat thing. Kids is a name for them and an informal name for children, because who says that it's not the Victorian era? According to Heron, the word kid is disrespectful and dissuades royal children from being seen as individuals. You mean like how sheltering them and not allowing them everyday friends or normal reality or exposure to the real world under the guise of safety, but it's more so they grow up in a bubble of unrealistic world perspective and can't understand problems morally and empathetically as an adult, only in a political sense. You mean like that? Sounds like what they're doing. And speaking of the Windsors, did y'all know Charles specifically sucks? A lot of kings imposed a lot of rules for their servants, but something about King Charles gets the most under the skin. Maybe it's because he had some pretty frivolous, unrealistic asks for a man who just got the throne this year. So listen to his tea procedure alone. Charles is very particular for how his tea is served when he's visiting the Paladinian house. When preparing the tea, you must use a teaspoon measurement of tea leaves per cup, and then there must be an exact temperature of 7 degrees Celsius for green tea and 100 degrees Celsius for Earl Grey or English breakfast. The prince's hot beverage must also be checked with a thermometer before being served, and honey should always be used to sweeten the tea rather than sugar. When serving the tea to the prince, the teaspoon should be situated precisely to the right underneath of the handle of the cup. Clive Goodman, a royal reporter for News of the World, claimed that Prince Charles does nothing himself. He described the morning scene in which Charles gets ready for the day, but all the preparation is done for him. He gets up up in the morning, his bathrobe is there waiting for him. He walks into the bathroom, the bath is drawn for him already. Even when he gets out of the bath, the towel is already folded in a special way, so he just has to sit in it and wrap it around himself. Then he goes into the dressing room, his clothes are laid out for him, even his socks, left and right, are in the exact right spot. Charles even has valets squeeze 1 inch of toothpaste onto his toothbrush every morning. If anyone gets anything wrong, everyone is scolded. Gosh, and I'm sure y'all remember the viral video of him from September of 2022 forcing a servant to come clear off the desk of like 3 pieces of paper because he couldn't have done it himself.
Number 7. Party hard. Zhu Huzhou was the emperor of the Ming Dynasty in the early 1500s. Now, lately we've been talking about kings and queens. We're on part 2s for both now, and there's a good amount who simply just aren't ready. They're too young to rule. Like Joffrey from Game of Thrones. Kings like that actually existed. They were horrible. They were young, they were too young to know what was right and wrong. Plus, they usually have some corrupt parents whispering in their ears the entire time. Zhu took the throne at just age 14, and for a while, ministers were confident that he would grow into the role and become the leader that he was born to be. Well, when he got older, he transformed a zoo just outside of Beijing. He transformed it into his own personal brothel. Yum. I mean, on one hand, I'm glad the animals are free, but like, a zoo? You couldn't find a more romantic place? Can convert an Applebee's to a brothel, maybe? I don't know, something with AC? His final days were spent partying, and some would say a little bit too hard. He got intoxicated and fell from a boat. That's how he ended his life. Honestly, not a bad way to go out. Pretty OG.
At number 6, love game. A lot of kings and queens throughout history have been known to engage in the horizontal hustle a lot. I mean, when you're a ruler of a kingdom, you don't really have much to do in your spare time, so what else are you gonna do? Play a board game? No. These monarchs were getting busy all the time, but there was one king who was just so obsessed with getting a good old pickle tickle that it just became his whole personality. King Philip V was known to be a nymphomaniac, and he liked doing the deed a lot, but because at the time, the Catholic Church said that having sexy time with anyone but your spouse was a sin, the king and his wife were getting busy all the time. Eventually, his first wife caught on to how to use this to her advantage, and she would often refuse to sleep with him until she got her way with anything she suggested or demanded from him. You would think that he would catch on to this game, but maybe his urges were just so strong because he always caved and gave her what he wanted. Obviously, this man did not follow Hoodville. Absolutely not. Just to give you guys an idea of how obsessed this guy was, when his wife was on her deathbed, before she went he literally tried to get one last bang in. On her deathbed. Like, dude, not the time.
Number 5. George V. We love hobbies here on Bumblebee. I mean, I used to collect special quarters growing up. I swear to God. The only time I've ever been good at saving money was when I was 12. I would see one of these and be like, don't touch it. George V turned out he loved stamps. A lot. Like a lot. Since he was a wee young lad, he was collecting these little guys. Here's the unusually impressive part about him though and his hobby. He continued to collect stamps during World War I. This guy was busy, everybody's trying to stay alive, and George is just licking stamps in the library like a prince. Like all collections, it started at an early age and now it's at the point where it's past impressive and it's just borderline strange. This guy had albums on albums of stamps. He had around 330 albums, each with 60 pages full of stamps. Quick maths, that's like 20,000 pages full of stamps. So naturally he was nicknamed the King of Stamps, or rather the King of Philately, the official term for collecting stamps. It's a nice word. Philately. Philately. Back in 1905, he set an all-time stamp record, which I didn't even know that was the thing, and it was the most money ever spent on a single stamp. The guy dropped like 220,000 US on a single stamp. Somebody even asked the prince down the road if he had heard about this idiot who spent 1,400 pounds on a stamp, and he was proud of it. He was like, that was me, you wanna see it? The next King George is a little different, to say the least.
At number 4, womanizer. I'm going to preface this by saying that George IV of England was voted as England's worst king by historians, so that should already tell you a lot about this guy. Georgie here was yet another one of those monarchs who was a little too invested in his intimate conquests, you know? Now we do know that the encounters that he was on were all consensual, so that's a plus. However, he was still creepy about it. Yeah. This man tried everything to get a woman to sleep with him. He would throw a tantrum if she said no, or threaten to end his life if he didn't get to do the 8-legged nature dance, you know? Somehow, this had a pretty good success rate, even though he was not a catch at all. It feels like this was one of those situations where you kind of just give in to make him stop talking, you know? Anyways, This guy was super creepy because on top of the lengths that he would go to just to get some time in the sack, he also kept trophies of his conquests. He would ask each of the people he slept with for a lock of their hair, and he kept them all. Back then, it was kind of common for lovers to keep locks of each other's hair, but George's collection was alarming because of just how many locks of hair there were. After the king died, his brothers found 7,000 envelopes, each with a lock of hair that was, quote, enough to stuff a sofa, end quote. Fun fact, if you want to see this insane collection, it is in a museum in Scotland, so check that out if you want, I guess.
Number 3. Kleptomania Part 2. On our spoiled queens list, Brie mentioned Queen Mary and how she just couldn't stop stealing, which is hilarious to me, just this old lady stealing your shit. Well, the last king of Egypt also had sticky fingers. He was even better at it too. Check this out. Farouk I was the youngest son of Egypt's first king, Fuad I. Now born in 1920 in Alexandria, and in his early days at school, he couldn't concentrate. The king sent him to England even after to hopefully find a better way of teaching, something that works for him, but still it was to no avail. Once the king passed away in 1936, Farouk then got the throne, but also so much property and so much money. He had hundreds of fancy cars, 75,000 acres of land. This guy had it all. Literally, he had anything he could think of, but still he felt like he needed to take more, to steal. At 17 years old, he would slam 12 eggs for breakfast and then wash it down with 30 bottles of beer. Nutritious and delicious. Horrible. On top of the fact that he loved to steal, he was the biggest hoarder. So he had thousands of shirts, randomly. He also had 50 diamond-studded walking sticks for some reason, and like a prince such as myself, he too collected coins. I mean, his collection was much nicer, but still, great minds think alike. Spoiled minds think alike, rather. Oh shit, this is eye-opening. One of the most bizarre facts about Farouk was he pickpocketed Winston Churchill once. He took the guy's watch. After everything I just said, he still decided to steal his watch. What a gem. We love him. Yeah.
At number 2, the king of pettiness. Let's talk about a ruler that the Indian state of Alwar has described as controversial. If his own people are calling him controversial, then you know something's up, and boy, you better strap in because you're in for a wild ride with this one. Maharaja Jai Singh was pretty eccentric in a pretty dark way. He was known to have a temper and act on impulse, and he did some very questionable and downright scary things. He was known to be very competitive and hated to lose. One time while playing polo, he and his team lost, and so in retaliation he blamed the horse he was using and made the horse get extra crispy. He fired his horse. I'm sure you know where I'm going with that. If not, use your noodle, I don't know. Unfortunately, the cruelty towards living things didn't stop at animals, and he was also known to kidnap women from the streets and go all criminal minds on them. On a slightly lighter note, though, the Maharaja was also known to be very petty. Once he went into a Rolls-Royce dealership, and the person working there thought that he was broke and ignored him. Thinking that this was insanely rude, he bought 7 Rolls-Royces, sent them back to India, and used them to pick up garbage. This guy was really just doing the absolute most.
And coming in at our number 1 spot, King Ludwig II. Home renovation shows rock my world. I can watch Love It or List It for months at a time. It's the dream, building your own home one day, and if you're a king, well, it's pretty easy to get that done. In our Spoiled Queens Part 2, I mentioned a princess that had a house made of ice, literal ice. Well, King Ludwig II had numerous castles built to resemble fairy tales. Literally, like fairy tales. I gotta admit, I kind of love this a lot. Ludwig was only 18 when he became the king of Bavaria in 1864, and then he had castles, like castles, more than one, built after he was inspired from romantic literature and spending some time at the opera. The kid was a dreamer, you gotta love it. He would spend his nights in one castle looking through a telescope at his new castle being built, so he would just watch it all night. That's like the king's way of waiting for your Amazon delivery. Just standing there, just like, oh, it's coming. 17 years and it's done. Just 4 years in, he designed his own castle, and to this day, it's one of the most photographed places in the world. Neuschwanstein Castle. Go check it out. It's literally a paradise. Kicking off the list at number 10, a fool. While ancient kings have all the riches one man can possibly have, it's still somehow never enough. Kings also have their own walking, talking party. Yeah, how fun is that? The earliest accounts of the fool go back to the 11th century. These fools were hired to liven up the party. Most of you may have an image of a jester in your head just jumping around on tables, telling jokes, juggling with big pointy shoes, wearing pajamas. Yeah, that's pretty accurate. It was pretty fun. One of the best jobs to have was the title of a minstrel or a fool. It was an honor to have, really, and the fool's payment was no joke. Roland Le Picheur was rewarded with 30 acres of land from King Henry II, as long as he showed up to court every year on Christmas Day to fart. Literally, he would show up and fart around. But these fools also held responsibility in their silly little lips. Fools needed to find the balance of humor and wit. It was harder back then than anything. Many of these jesters were given the role of advisor to the king and queen. The phrase, "don't shoot the messenger," this is where it comes from. The jester would have to tell them horrible news, but in a fun, positive way. For example, back in 1340, King Philip IV, his fleet was destroyed in naval battle, the British completely wiped them out, and it was an otherwise devastating loss, but the jester, the fool, brought this news in a light way. He said to the king, "They don't even have the guts to jump into the water like our brave French do." And then he farted and disappeared.
Number 9. Access to clean water. Today in a modern world, there are things that we just can't live without. A vape pen, Starbucks, and that weird looking back massager that everyone says they bought for their backs, but it's actually for their undercarriage. Speaking of undercarriages, you don't want to drink from the water from underneath one. Dirty, muddy street water is bad for your health. The ancient kings of old knew this. It was common knowledge that drinking dirty water could lead to you spending more time squatting over a hole than spending time with your family, and nobody wants that. Life for citizens who were not royals could have it pretty rough. Ancient kings had the luxury of having clean water, or somewhat, it's still kinda not so clean, or at least more clean than the commoners. Through methods of fresh spring water, boiling, and even some early filtration methods, they had access to better water that wouldn't make their guts hurt. With that being said, a lot of times given the sussy nature of water, a lot of kings just drank alcohol, which honestly might have saved them since the alcohol could possibly kill harmful bacteria. The one time in life that boozing might save your life. Anyone got a beer?
Number 8. Ladies first. These ancient kings, they could literally do whatever they wanted. And it's important to note how they would act if they didn't get what they wanted, right? Like George IV of England, he's referred to as England's worst king by historians. Great title, even worse than King Joffrey, what do you know? It's one thing to spiral into debt, that's classic king behavior. MC Hammer went broke, we get it, it happens. But George IV, he was all about the ladies, a little bit too much. All he wanted in life was just to hook up with women, that was it, his only desire in life. And if they weren't interested, George was known to throw fits. He would cry and stomp his feet, literally. You know how those brave and bold kings do? George would offer these ladies money, although they weren't for sale, so that wasn't a great plan and didn't work a lot of the time. And George would go so far to threaten his own well-being if they refused. How terrible is that guy, right? Just imagine that conversation, how insane. What takes this to the absolute next level though is that George would keep a lock of his partner's hair after they had spent the night together. Now I know you're freaking out, maybe you're like, huh? Maybe you just choked on your rye bread sandwich a bit, that's more than fair. At the time, this wasn't abnormal behavior. I mean, you know, lovers would exchange their hair instead of phone numbers, I get it, it's back in the old days. But George, he had a lot of hair. He had like a lot of hair. He had like 7,000 envelopes filled with hair. I'm over here exchanging phone numbers at the club. Like, what am I doing wrong? Am I, doink? Call me, peace.
At number 7, Jahangir. So this guy was super impatient to become the ruler and was getting tired of Daddy Akbar taking his time. So he revolted. Damn, this court honestly was just rife with rebellion. They never got tired of it. In 1599, while his father was otherwise engaged and away from the palace, Prince Salim led a revolt. During the revolt, he even skinned a man alive. Akbar was pissed about this and wrote to his son and said, quote, "I have never skinned a bird alive in my life, and you have treated a human being in this manner." Jahangir then went on to conspire against a close advisor of his father named Abul Fazl, whom Jahangir killed in a small battle. Despite Akbar being devastated at his son's behavior, he was the only male heir left to inherit, so on Akbar's deathbed, he forgave his son and implored the nobles to recognize him as a leader. At number 6, sewed to an ox. Now Jahangir was emperor, but the trouble didn't stop there. I saw some sources recognize him as a somewhat benevolent figure, while others said that he was the exact opposite. He was pretty brutal, and his first task was crushing a rebellion against that which his own son began. apple not far from the tree. He was traveling to Lahore when he came across two nobles who were sympathetic to his son's cause, so he decided to punish them in a very peculiar and violent way. He ordered that one be sewed to the skin of an ass and the other to an ox. Now that is messed up. When he got to Lahore to face the rebels, he crushed them and blinded his own son as punishment. A ruler couldn't have any impediment, so therefore his son could no longer pursue the role. Then he hung his son's followers outside of Taxali Gate. Yeah, so even within the confines of war, this guy had some pretty messed up ideas. At number 5, the horse and his boy. On the less violent end of the spectrum, Jahangir was actually a big fan of the arts, science, and worldly things. Unlike his father, who couldn't read and write, an interesting skill for a ruler not to have, Jahangir was all about it. He really wasn't interested in military, which was a task he left to his son. But he did inherit his father's wealth, and considering he wasn't working in the military, he had time to indulge his curiosity. In his memoirs, there are fantastic paintings of exotic animals. There's a painting of a zebra that has a very funny story behind it. The zebra was being taken as a gift to the Safavid Shah, and it was traveling through the port of the empire. Jahangir heard about it and had it brought to court first, and didn't believe that it was real. He thought that it was a painted horse, so he had people try and wash them off. Only when the paint didn't come off did he realize his mistake and ordered that the wondrous creature be painted. At number 4, Shah Jahan and the Taj Mahal. Okay, so this one isn't messed up for violence or anything, but it is the ultimate love story, and we just can't leave it off this list. There is one part that is messed up to me because, man, I don't even know, but we will get to that. If you've ever been to India, then one of the stops you made on your trips was probably to the Taj Mahal, a breathtaking mausoleum built by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan to commemorate the love of his life. Considering how big and intricate it is, you know that their love was bigger than any storybook. An Indian poet called the Taj Mahal a teardrop on the cheek of time, a testament to grief and power. Mumtaz Mahal was Shah Jahan's favorite wife, forsaking all of his other wives just to be with her. They went everywhere together, even on military missions. This is where, from my perspective, where things get crazy. This woman delivered 14 children for her husband. 14. Sadly, whilst giving birth to the last, she passed away, inspiring her king to build this massive structure. Both Shah Jahan and his love are buried beneath it. At number 3, brothers at odds. Shah Jahan's rule was considered the golden rule of the Mughal Empire, so how do you top that? Aurangzeb did not even bother trying, and he kinda sucked. He was Shah Jahan's third son, and he was a very military-minded man, showing tactical and strategic military skill and unrivaled determination. Whereas his brother was a man of letters, and no, not the kind from Supernatural. Aurangzeb wanted power, and so in order to secure his rule, he confined his ailing father to his own palace, caused the death of one of his brothers, and had 2 more of his brothers, a son and a nephew, executed. He was literally committing fratricide left, right, and center. But it didn't matter to him because he gained control. His desire to prematurely end the lives of those who stood in his way was described as, quote, a wolf thirsting for the blood of his brothers, end quote. You would think that this motivation to gain power and rule on his own terms would mean that he had big plans for the empire, which in a way is true, but those plans and changes led to a lot of oppression, but we will get to that in a bit. At number 2, staked. Before we get into the oppression that Aurangzeb caused to his empire, let's talk about Emperor Farrukh Siyar. Farrukh Siyar was emperor of the Mughal Empire from 1713 to 1719. He was described as an incapable ruler who gave his power to all of his advisors. His rule caused many conspiracies and plots to arise within the court. He caused a lot of people a lot of pain for his plight for power. With the help of his allies, he gave many of his enemies the gift of the big sleep, but by far the most ruthless thing he did was kill Jahandar Shah and Zulfikar Khan Nusrat Jung. What made their deaths so brutal was the fact that when they went the emperor hung their heads on poles, and just to add insult to injury, he made their parents walk at their funeral. Luckily for the people of the Mughal Empire, Farrukh Siyar was killed by unknown assailants at the instructions of his close relatives, putting an end to his awful reign. And finally, at number 1, the Great Oppressor. Aurangzeb's rule sort of had 2 chapters to it. At first, Aurangzeb was a capable ruler of a mixed Muslim-Hindu empire who was feared yet respected for his vigor and skill, but around 1680, Aurangzeb's rule changed drastically in both policy and attitude. His once unified people of both Muslims and Hindus broke apart, and people of Hindu faith became subordinates, not colleagues. On top of that, Aurangzeb added some more oppression to the mix and not only destroyed Hindu temples, but he also reimposed the jizya tax on non-Muslims, after the tax was initially banned by Emperor Akbar. For the first 20 years of Aurangzeb's rule, he did not impose a tax, but all of a sudden he started demanding these payments, and historians believe that Hindu uprisings are what caused the emperor to act harshly towards the non-Muslim population. This discrimination caused a revolt to unfold that Aurangzeb's third son supported. Aurangzeb spent his last 50 years taking his aggressions out on the Hindus in the empire, and it's for this reason that he is remembered by many as a tyrant. At number 10, some background. The Mughal dynasty in India was founded by Babur, a descendant of the one, the only, Genghis Khan and Tamerlane. After he defeated a sultan of Delhi named Ibrahim Lodi in 1526, Babur was the first step in the Mughal dynasty that would last for over 3 centuries. To say that the empire was immense is an understatement. The empire ruled over 103 million people, probably even more. The Mughals were rooted in Muslim beliefs and were noted for their well-organized government and cultural sophistication. Many of the rulers tried to integrate the Hindus and Muslims under one state, but as we will find out from this list, it was not an easy thing to do, which ended up causing a lot of strife. Many rulers of the empire flip-flopped back and forth between being merciful and tyrannical towards the Hindus, adding to centuries of oppression. At number 9, blinded. Humayun was set to inherit the throne from his father, much to the jealousy of his brothers. He was 23 when he ascended the throne in 1530 after the death of his father. His brothers reigned over different fiefs, but none of them were satisfied unless they had the crown. He also wasn't the best ruler. Humayun was sent into exile for 15 years after he was overthrown by one of his father's generals, Sher Shah. Humayun fled and eventually ended up in Persia, where he built back up an army through his partnership with the Shah. Slowly he took back his land, facing his own brothers who were constantly scheming against him. But Babur, his father, made him promise that he would never lay a hand on his brothers. But his brother Kamran continued to threaten him, and one instance while defending a fort turned on the innocents trapped inside and took their lives viciously. Kamran, not a good dude. Something needed to be done. He eventually catches his scheming brothers, blinds his brother Kamran, and chains his brother Askari. A little messed up, but not bad for war. Before I carry on with the rest of the video, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel and maybe consider leaving a like on this video if you're enjoying it so far. At number 8, Akbar. Humayun continued to deal with the competition of his brothers until finally his reign came to an end, but not in the way that you would expect. He was carrying a bunch of books up some stairs and he accidentally fell, leading to a lethal head injury. His 13-year-old son Akbar had to inherit the throne. Akbar would later become known as the Great, but that doesn't mean that he didn't do some questionable things. Where his father failed to conquer, Akbar swept through. But just like his father, he encountered jealousy and dangerous ambition in the dark corners of his reign. In Delhi, an attempt to assassinate him was made, the bowman nearly missing him. Who was behind it? The slave of a nobleman who recently tried to start a rebellion. But the plot thickens. Akbar's foster brother's mother had further designs to establish power for herself through her son, Adam Khan. Khan actually ended up taking the life of Akbar's foster father, which led to Akbar throwing him down the stairs and therefore killing him. The mother died 40 days later due to grief. Grief over her son or the loss of power? Who knows?
Number 7, Xerxes I. He is often portrayed as a tyrant, and it is likely that as a Persian king, his disregard for local traditions did not endear him to the Egyptians. Xerxes I was very much a pharaoh in absentia, where his failed attempts to invade Greece ensured that his portrayal by Greek historians was also seen in a Hollywood extension of the film 300 was not kind. He had a reputation for harsh punishments, womanizing, and draining the Persian Empire's coffers. He built immense palaces and other projects at Persepolis and left his mark on the history of both Europe and Asia. He was more or less a power-driven conqueror. All he wanted was to conquer Greece due to the conflicts his father had started. He would loot, pillage, enslave Persians, but eventually was defeated by Cyprus. Number 6, Pharaoh Psamtik III. I too would send my armies to protect cats, and even though I'm still upset about that one pope who declared people to kill a bunch of cats, this pharaoh seems to be pretty cool to me. Psamtik III, he knew that cats were considered the best, as cats were often associated with Bastet, who is the goddess of fertility, protection, and good health. As a result, it was considered a crime in ancient Egypt to harm or through inaction allow a cat to come to harm. But he had placed the well-being of cats above his own people when Pharaoh Psamtik III literally told his army not to fight because an army commander had released hundreds of cats onto the battlefield. That commander was the Persian king Cambyses II, who, knowing of the Egyptians, loved cats, and his men actually collected a bunch of cats prior to the battle and ordered them to simply walk up to the front gate. The Egyptians, under threat of death from their pharaoh, had no choice but to let Cambyses' men walk straight into the city unchecked. Cambyses' men then methodically slaughtered anyone who dared challenge them using shields with cats to draw on them. Number 5, Menkaure. Menkaure, a pharaoh who ruled in the 26th century BC, definitely had his doubts. When an oracle came to him and told him that he only had 6 years left to live, he was terrified and he did everything he could to avoid it. And he decided he could fool the gods as long as the night never came. Menkaure figured if a new day never began and time could not pass and so he could not die. Right. So every night he lit up as many lamps as he could and convinced himself it was still daytime for the rest of his life. Menkaure would not sleep. He spent every night drinking and celebrating under artificial light, terrified of the moment when his light finally went out, but of course he did not die. Not sure if it was due to his age or the fact that it is not medically recommended to succumb to insomnia, as one would increase a risk of hypertension, diabetes, obesity, depression, heart attacks, and a stroke. He died at the age of 32 and ruled for roughly 18 to 22 years. Number 4, Thutmose I. Although history does call him a great leader as he was able to expand Egypt's empire in Nubia, which today is known as Sudan, as well as his advances in Syria, with his advancements like that also equals to a fair share of violence and catastrophes that affect the very people he plundered and pillaged. Known for his cruelty, which was on full HD display, he found a Nubian king and took off his head with his hands, and then sailed home with his body hanging on the ship's prow. He wanted to intimidate his rivals and potentially rebels from messing with him ever again. However, this stunt caused more problems as it led to multiple battles and wars. During the rules of monarchs, cults were formed to worship them, and Thutmose I's cult lasted for centuries after his death, which is an unusual occurrence, and this statue of monarch is at the heart of a tableau representing offerings and ceremonies in his honor. Number 3, Akhenaten. Egyptians had many gods, but for Akhenaten, he said, we're going to have one god, and it is the one I can only worship. Aten, the god of sun, is meant to major upheaval on how Egypt was run and took a lot of work to do it. So much in fact that he literally worked his people to death. He built a whole new city in honor of this god, moved 20,000 people there, and had them built it no matter how badly their bodies ached. These people had to push through everything. Based on the bones in the town cemetery, more than 2/3 of his workers broke a bone while they were working, and a good 1/3 of them broke their spines. The people were barely fed, and almost every person in the town was malnourished, and they were not allowed to do anything about it. If they broke rank and tried to snatch a little something extra, they were sentenced to be repeatedly poked with a sharp object. And that was all for nothing. As soon as Akhenaten died, everything he did was destroyed, and his very name was erased from Egyptian history. Number 2, Ramesses II. Ramesses lived so long that people started getting seriously worried that he might not never die. In a time when most kings got assassinated within their first few years, Ramesses II lived up to 91 years old. He enjoyed his time alive too. Right up to the very end, he built more statues and monuments than anyone ever, and he slept with more women than anyone ever too. By the time he died, Ramesses II had at least 100 children with at least 9 wives, and it took a lot of sleeping with women to get there, but he made sure he put those hours in. When he invaded Kedah, he refused to sign a peace treaty unless they handed over their eldest daughter, and he did not shy away from his daughters either. He married at least 3 of his own kids, including his firstborn. Number 1, the Ptolemy Pharaohs. Finally, at number 1, we have the Ptolemy Pharaohs. This family of mad kings are definitely on this list. Starting with Ptolemy IV, he eliminated his mother, who got rid of his dad for having an affair with her mom, which is his grandma, and then Ptolemy IV married his sister and then got rid of her after her husband brother's death. Are you with me so far? Because there's more. Ptolemy VI fought his brother Ptolemy V for the throne and married his sister Cleopatra II, and then Ptolemy VII was killed by his uncle, where Ptolemy VIII married Cleopatra II, but then he had an affair with her daughter Cleopatra III. Then she killed her sister Cleopatra IV and was later got by her widowed brother-in-law. I'm gonna go fast forward a bit because there's a lot of back and forth with the different Ptolemies and Cleopatras until we get to the one that we know. Cleopatra VII. As we know in history, that Cleopatra was the last ruler of Egypt. Basically, her father, Ptolemy XII, decapitated her sister because she hated him, and eventually Cleopatra VII had to marry her brother, got rid of him, married the other brother, and then also got rid of him, and then her sister dragged her through the streets of Rome as a prisoner because of Julius Caesar, and had her sister sacrificed at a temple because of her other lover, Mark Antony. These are terrible people and are definitely insane. So Some were not too mad, some were just ambitious leaders with great desires to rule, and others were just insane. After all, we could only gather so much from what we know from history, especially from these times.
At number 10, Caligula. This guy reigned for 4 years, and the amount of straight up excess he demanded led him to be the first Roman emperor to be assassinated. Caligula was 25 years old when he took power in 37 AD, and he was great. He announced political reforms and recalled all exiles, but within the same year he contracted an illness that sent him a little loopy. Like to the degree of ordering hundreds of Roman merchant ships to form a 2-mile floating bridge across the Bay of Bauli so he could spend 2 days galloping back and forth across it on his horse Incitatus. Speaking of his horse, he loved that animal so much, giving him his own house with a marble stall and ivory manger. And he almost appointed the horse consul before Caligula met his end. It got worse in the years after his demise, like in 39 and 40 AD when he led campaigns to the Rhine and the English Channel, where he actually avoided battles and instead did things like commanding his troops to plunder the sea, which means gathering shells in their helmets. The perfectly sane kind of things that you do when your favorite quote is, "Remember that I have the right to do anything to anybody." Number 9, Ramses II. He literally has the most statues of himself of all the 4,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs. That is really all I gotta say, actually. Ramses II was undoubtedly the greatest pharaoh. I don't know if that justifies his spoiled ways, but it helps explain them at the very least. He was a master builder, a war hero, and brokered peace all around over his crazy long reign. But he was also really good at the whole propaganda thing. Like I said, he has statues of himself all over Egypt that even to this day are hard to avoid. Not to mention all the buildings built in his name, including a whole temple to himself and one to one of his wives, Nefertari. He moved the capital from Thebes to the new capital he created, named, unsurprisingly, Pi Ramses, from which he ruled for 67 years, had literally hundreds of children and dozens of wives. He also, kind of hilariously, renovated statues and temples erected by previous pharaohs with his tag, either to pay respect or, what I'm going to go with, just to say, look at this big statue of some other dude, but always remember, trademarked by Ramses the Great. P.S. I'm awesome. Number 8, William II. Usually being overshadowed by his father William the Conqueror and his successor Henry I, William II wasn't a well-liked king, particularly by the church, because William kept positions for bishops empty so he could take their incomes, which made me laugh when I read it actually. The Archbishop of Canterbury Anselm really had an issue with William, even going into exile until William ceased to live. But this just left the revenues of the Archbishop of Canterbury vacant, making William able to claim those funds as well until the end of his reign. He obviously was not a fan of the church, but his armies definitely were a fan of him. He was great when it came to warfare and was able to pretty much guarantee loyalty by showing it. William didn't have any heirs or wives, which led people to question his preferences, if you know what I mean. He ultimately met his end at the tip of an arrow during a hunting accident, but he was always remembered for being ruthless and giving in to his vices.
Number 7, Catherine de Medici. Serving as the Queen of France from 1547 to 1559, Catherine de Medici had enormous political sway over her sons, the French kings Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. They reigned through the French Wars of Religion and faced problems with a group of Calvinist Protestants called the Huguenots. It is wildly believed by historians that de Medici attempted to have their leader, Gaspard II de Coligny, assassinated. The attempt failed, and fearing retaliation from the most powerful Huguenots, de Medici planned to slay them all before they could take action. The result was that St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which resulted in the passing of between 5,000 and 30,000 Huguenots. Number 6, Lady Elizabeth Bathory. Born in 1560 on a family estate in Royal Hungary, Elizabeth Bathory was of noble lineage and privilege with education, wealth, and a lofty social ranking. Her first taste of the morbidly bizarre was introduced to her during the early years of her life, when she suffered seizures which may have been epilepsy. The treatment for such bouts included feeding the patient human remains and bits of skull from a non-sufferer. Yummy. She bore witness to brutal punishments and executions carried out by her father, officers, and was influenced by family members involved with Satanism and witchcraft, the fun stuff. When she was barely in the double digits of age, Elizabeth was engaged to Count Fernek Nadesty, thank you, who she later married. Her husband spent much of the time away from home fighting the Ottomans, leaving Elizabeth to run the estate. Her Satanism became more pronounced as time wore on. Upon the passing of her husband in 1601, her vicious crimes escalated. Most of her victims were girls around the age of the time that she got married, and were usually the daughters of lesser gentry who sent their daughters to court to learn etiquette. Her favorite punishment methods included using pins to stick under the victim's nails, and covering her victims in honey to leave them out and be eaten by ants and other insects. She's really just great. Other methods included whipping her victims with nettles and frequently burning people, especially the downstairs bits. After burning her victims, she would even dump them in icy water. Many of her victims were punished to the point of passing, and some of whom were buried in unmarked locations. Some sources claim she engaged in people munching, making her one of the darkest people in history. Elizabeth and a few of her servants were eventually arrested in 1610, and her accomplices were put to trial the next year. With over 300 witnesses and numerous testimonials, a guilty verdict was assured. A servant girl who claimed to have seen evidence in Elizabeth's private books stated that her victims numbered into the 600s. The accomplices were sentenced to be slain, and she was confined to a bricked up room with slits for air and the delivery of food. She was found deceased a few years later. Number 5. Marie Antoinette. France's queen between 1774 and 1792 was Marie Antoinette, who was the last queen before the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette had quite a reputation for splurging on expensive things and found herself in many scandals. One such scandal was the affair of the diamond necklace, which sounds like a Pink Panther movie. Countess de la Motte, a young lady, pretended to be the queen's friend and entered the French court in 1785. She fooled a high society member into believing that Antoinette loved him. She even hired a body selling worker and disguised her as the queen and convinced the man that Antoinette wanted to purchase a diamond necklace. The jewelry cost 1.6 million livres, which is basically like $12 million today. The money was never paid, and the queen had no clue about what had taken place. Although Antoinette was innocent, the public despised her. Granted, she is mostly known for her infamous dialogue. When the French subjects could not afford bread, she said let them eat cake, which fueled the French Revolution, and it ultimately led to her being executed. Number 4. Queen of Castile. Joanna la Loca was the Queen of Castile from 1504 to 1516, and she suffered from various mental disorders. After her husband passed away in 1506, her father buried his body. However, Joanna used to open the tomb and caress her husband. Ugh. Ultimately, she ordered the body to be dug out, and, she kept doing stuff to it. I'm not gonna get into it, it's a little graphic. Additionally, she would carry his coffin everywhere with her and actually kept him under her bed for quite some time. Years later, she allowed his burial outside of her window. Honestly, it's so creepy. Why would you do that to a body? Number 3. Maria Eleanor of Brandenburg. Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, born on November 11th in 1599 and passed away on March 28th, 1655. That's right, she made it quite a while. She held the title of Queen of Sweden from 1620 to 1632 as the wife of King Gustav II Adolf. Coming from a noble German family, she belonged to the prestigious House of Hohenzollern, and I'm definitely gonna mispronounce that. However, when Maria and Gustav gave birth to a girl with a genetic condition causing excessive hair growth, Maria was deeply shocked. The unexpected appearance of her daughter, combined with societal beauty expectations, really pushed Maria to her limits. She considered her daughter ugly and refused to care for what she perceived as a monstrous creature. When Gustav passed away when Christina was only 7, Maria blamed her for his passing. For a year, Maria subjected Christina to harsh punishment, confined her to blacking out, darkened rooms to mourn her father in solitude for extended periods, even placing Gustav's open casket into Christina's room and demanding that she sleep next to it. That's way too morbid even by my standards. Good lord. Number 2. Sissy the Dragon Lady. The story of Sissy's rise to power is a remarkable one. Born at a time when Chinese women were politically invisible, Sissy managed to acquire enormous political influence by exploiting her position as a royal concubine, engaging in court intrigues, and manipulating those around her. By the end of the 1860s, Sissy had become the most powerful individual in China. Her will and her reach even exceeded 2 male emperors who she frequently bypassed or overruled. Sissy was born Lan Qiu in 1835, the daughter of a minor Manchu official, and at age 15 she was selected as a potential concubine for the emperor and relocated to the Forbidden City. She was elevated to the status of concubine by 18 and eventually gave birth to the emperor's only son, Zaichun, a feat that earned her another promotion in the palace's hierarchy. The emperor passed away in 1861, shortly after the disastrous Second Opium War, and left the throne to his only son. As the mother of the reigning emperor, Sissi was given the courtesy title Dowager Empress. By this point, Sissi had become adept at manipulation, palace intrigues, and power games. Through forged evidence and false testimony, she engineered the arrest of the 8 ministries, 3 of whom were later executed. With the regency council gone, Sissi became the de facto regent for the duration of her son's reign until his early passing from smallpox in 1875. Another rumor claims that 3,000 ebony boxes were needed to store her jewelry collection, so hey, she was a bit of a hoarder. And at number 1, Agrippina the Younger. Julia Agrippina, also referred to as Agrippina the Younger, was Roman empress from 49 to 54 AD, the 4th wife and niece of Emperor Claudius, and the mother of Nero. After the death of her first husband, Agrippina tried to make shameless advances to the future emperor Galba, who showed no interest in her and was devoted to his wife Amelie Lepida. On one occasion, Galba's mother-in-law gave Agrippina a public reprimand and a slap in the face before a whole bevy of married women. Agrippina was one of the most prominent women in Julio-Claudian dynasty, functioning as the behind-the-scenes advisor in the affairs of the Roman state via powerful political ties. She maneuvered her son Nero into the line of succession. Claudius became aware of her plotting, but passed away in 54, and it was rumored that Agrippina poisoned him. Agrippina exerted a commanding influence in the early years of Nero's reign, but in 59 she was slain. Both ancient and modern sources describe Agrippina's personality as ruthless, ambitious, violent, and domineering.